theory has to have a priority.
Capitalism and artificial intelligence are the same thing.
The dimension of the future has disappeared.
There is actually no representation anymore.
There is no final resolution to contradiction.
Militant proletarian snake handling over abysses never gets much wilder than this.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Dangerous Maybe. And finally, for the first time, we are joined by Chris Cutrone on this channel. You've been on Nance's channel, but this is the first time, long overdue. And we are super happy to be having this conversation with you today. So everybody, here's what the plan is. We're going to spend the first part of this conversation talking about an essay from Chris's book, Marxism and Politics, Essays on Critical Theory and the Party, 2006 to 2024. And the essay is called Ends of Philosophy. Super interesting. I messaged you the other day and said, we want to read some of these essays. And I'm so glad that's the first one I really kind of tackled out of this. And so we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about some Nick Land related topics, techonomics, all that. And then we're going to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the Epstein situation. So, Chris, we're so happy to have you here. But before we get into the conversation, Nance, what is up with you?
Just hanging out, man. It's been, Mikey, as you know, we've had a big week. We released an epic 8-hour video. Just this morning, we released an epic 8-hour video reading of Xenofeminism, A Politics for Alienation. Excellent short little book. And I mean that having just gone through that book and also reading The Ends of Philosophy, I kept kind of coming to maybe not alienation, but like something akin to alienation, like what is philosophy, and what can it do or whatever. And I don't know, my mind has been on alienation a lot, and I think there's a lot of that in this piece. So I think it's excellent. And yeah, I always love talking to you, Chris. So thanks for coming back and talking with us.
So hell yeah. Okay, before we really get started, Chris, you're doing something very cool this year at Philosophy Portal. Can you tell people about it in case, they might be interested in joining?
Sure. So we're doing a year-long, once a month, 10-session course. And it's on the essays that I've collected in my 2 books, The Death of the Millennial Left and Marxism and Politics. The spring is basically The Death of the Millennial Left, and the fall is Marxism and Politics, even though it's a little bit lopsided in terms of the amount of pages. One book's like 250 pages, the other's 750 pages, so it's very different. Right, exactly. And they are companion volumes, right? So they're like 100 articles and 1,000 pages, basically. It's a lot of material. And but we're going through it systematically, basically the way the books divide up the essays. Yeah. And you'll see if they go together, they form, because it's one painting that my friend made, Stephanie Karamitsos, and they're sort of one painting divided into 2 parts. Yep. Absolutely. That's it. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yep. Cool. We had done a short kind of version of it like a year and a half ago, with Cadell on Philosophy Portal. We did like 4 weeks, and so now we're going to do 10 sessions, and we're going to get more into also the political aspect, because we left out the section in Marxism and Politics. It's about the party, which is basically about the history of Marxism as a practical political movement in its kind of heyday in the metropolitan countries in the turn of the 20th century. So yeah, I mean, I would encourage people interested to check it out and join. It's it's going to be a very productive discussion. We had our first meeting last month, and we're going to get into that. Was like preliminary. Now we're going to get into the meat of it.
Fantastic. Yeah, guys, if you're interested, check out it. Philosophy Portal. More information over there. And yeah, be an amazing year with Chris Cutrone over the Philosophy Portal. So, okay. Ends of philosophy. So what I love about this is, first off, it's a succinct piece, but it's dense. It's got a lot of meat to it, where you're talking about philosophy from your Marxist perspective. And you ask this question, what are the ends? And it's plural, ends of philosophy. And, Marx is, the poverty of philosophy or the misery of philosophy comes to mind. And there's different ways, different meanings of ends, satisfaction, goal. So the question is, what are the ends of philosophy? And how do you, as a Marxist, interpret what philosophy is and what our relationship to it should be?
Okay, so first of all, some background on the piece. So there was a internal discussion within Platypus back in 2018, and we decided to formalize it. So we were kind of exchanging messages on our listserv. Basically, it's known as the philosophy debate in Platypus. And I always think that that's a little bit of a misnomer. It wasn't much of a debate, but it was essentially about Hegel and Marx, and how to understand Marx from a philosophical point of view. And as I mentioned in the piece, there's a week on our yearly primary Marxist reading syllabus called Ends of Philosophy, where we read Karl Korsch's essay, Marxism and Philosophy, from 1923. And he does a sort of history of Marxism on the question of philosophy, meaning where did Marx come from, what's the philosophical background, and then how did Marxists talk about philosophy in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So that sort of historical view is very important. And I think that us now in the 21st century, looking back on the last 2 centuries, so the 19th century when Marx and Engels came to consciousness and did their writing, and then the 20th century, where there was a breakdown of Marxism that occurred, and there was the emergence of postmodernism. And there's also a kind of strong philosophical response to Marxism via Heidegger, which is inspirational for postmodernism. So there's been a question in the air since Hegel's time. So Marx talked about the crisis and disintegration of Hegelianism. Marx and Engels started out as young Hegelians, and they're critiquing the other young Hegelians or the left Hegelians. And how to understand that? Is that a failure to understand Hegel, or is it more of an objective crisis affecting philosophy itself and the social conditions for philosophy and the kind of objects of philosophy? So there was a crisis in the purpose of philosophy. And the young Hegelians were political radicals. Many of them called themselves communists and socialists. So they thought the reason that they're the young Hegelians or the left Hegelians is that they were interested in philosophy as a kind of thinking about freedom and emancipation and revolution. And Marx criticized that. So famously, the theses on Feuerbach, right? Which is not, Feuerbach was not a contemplative thinker by any means. He was a political radical. And he was very critical of his society, and he wanted a profound social transformation. Marx was criticizing that. And he had to deal with it, again, not just as a failure of thinking, but as an actual real-world political issue affecting society. right? So it's about the relationship of society and philosophy, and how philosophy has changed historically as a function of how society has changed. Now, Karl Korsch talks about what he calls a gap in the 19th century between Hegel and Neo-Kantianism. Like there's this kind of curious gap in the mid-19th century that is contemporaneous with Marx and Engels' own lifetimes. Now, it's not that no philosophy was done. There was kind of academicized right Hegelianism, conservative Hegelianism, old Hegelianism. There were also other phenomena going on. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are the standout people. And so thinking about like the aftermath of Hegel, it goes in different directions. There's a kind of conservative Hegel that's institutionalized, especially in the German-speaking world. There's still a kind of political radical Hegel that's taken up outside of Germany. So, for instance, the St. Louis Hegelians in the United States are, politically on the left, or at least progressive liberals, but they're trying to really think about things profoundly at the level of society and politics, as well as, metaphysically in terms of philosophy. But just bring up Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Marx. What are these outgrowths of Hegel? Are they reactions against Hegel? Are they, a continuation of Hegel? Are they a transformation of philosophy? Are they a rejection of philosophy? Like, are they anti-philosophies? Right? Because and also you could even say with Schopenhauer, there's already a kind of anti-philosophical bent to it. And really, standing behind all of that is the question of how Kant and Hegel fundamentally changed what philosophy was. So it's known as the 25 years of philosophy. So Kant inventing philosophy for the first time, and Hegel completing it, right? Which is very paradoxical because obviously philosophy is a thousands of year old phenomenon. And yet the idea was actually that wasn't really philosophy. That was traditional metaphysics. So coming out of the Enlightenment has its own anti-philosophical bent, right? The philosophs contra philosophy because they don't like any metaphysical system. There's David Hume empiricism, who treats all theory, all philosophy, all metaphysics skeptically. And then there's Kant saying, well, actually, no, we can't really do that. We have to deal with metaphysics, but critically. And so post-metaphysical philosophy, or a new philosophy and a revolutionary philosophy.
Would you say with Kant, this is where philosophy proper starts? Do you hold that position?
Yes.
Okay.
I do. Right. And the reason for that is that there's what Hegel would call self-consciousness that seems to be lacking prior to that.
And by
Now,
that, do you mean the fact that like Kant realizes the mind participates in the construction of experience? We're not neutral in this.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Right. So post-metaphysics means like taking a critical view and taking a view of metaphysics that is not like a kind of naive metaphysics that doesn't assume it. It has its predecessors. Of course, there's Descartes. I mean, there are many predecessors. There's Leibniz, there's Spinoza, there's Hume, of course, there's Locke. There are the Enlightenment philosophers, and there is Rousseau. And Rousseau is the radical Enlightenment, as the kind of radicalization of the Enlightenment. Now, it's very natural for us after that time to hive these things off, to say, okay, Rousseau's not a philosopher, he's like a social thinker. It's like the beginning of social theory. And, we just have to remind ourselves that in the 18th century, in the 1700s, everybody was a philosopher. Like Adam Smith, he's not an economist, he's a philosopher, he's a moral philosopher. And political economy is a subset of moral philosophy. And, so we have like political philosophy, social philosophy, philosophy of science. We've got all these specialized forms of philosophy that really beg the question of, yeah, but what do we even mean by philosophy? right? And I think that Kant is this kind of radical turning point in the history of philosophy where philosophy can ask questions about itself for the first time.
And thus critique is meaningfully born.
Yes. And it's, again, Karl Korsch, and other Marxists, they would say it's not accidental that this is happening at the time of the American and French revolutions. It's happening at the time of, after the English Revolution. It's happening in an era of revolution, and coming to a certain kind of self-consciousness about itself. So, as Marx put it, the move from Cook to Locke, the beginning of the bourgeois revolution, was radical Protestantism and invokes like the Bible, but then John Locke has like a kind of secular, humanistic, historical understanding of the meaning of the bourgeois revolution, rather than cloaking it in terms of Christianity, right? And that the 18th century is really about that. The 1700s is the time when this transformation of the world with bourgeois society sees itself as itself rather than as the restoration of Christianity or the resurrection of the ancient world, right? Classical antiquity.
Great. Okay. So maybe we can go more into now that we've got the context, we can go more into the content of the essay. You started off with a section called Misery. It's the essay is comprised of 7 short sections. First one is Misery. And yeah, it brings to my, what did Marx mean by the poverty or misery of philosophy? Is it that philosophy is bourgeois ideology or false consciousness?
So, I was playing with that, of course, because we do think of capitalism as the era of misery, right? As the era of austerity. So Proudhon, he wrote the Philosophy of Misery, saying that political economy was a kind of philosophical rationalization for misery, and sort of railed against it and, tried to critique it. And in an interesting way, Proudhon thought of himself as combining Adam Smith, Hegel, and the Bible. So he has a kind of Jeremiad character to him, Proudhon. And, famously, he wrote in What is Property, the preceding book, Property is Theft. Marx's 1844 manuscripts are his first pass at a critique of Proudhon. And so he critiques Proudhon's approach to political economy and philosophy, and also morality. But really to political economy and philosophy. And because Proudhon thought of himself as a Hegelian, Marx also attacks that, right? So he basically says, well, he's kind of a poor follower of Adam Smith and a poor follower of Hegel, but really the issue is that Proudhon is unclear about what has changed from the 1700s to the 1800s. He's unclear about the significance of the Industrial Revolution, other than to say that the workers have been ripped off and have been immiserated. So I always like to say, Marx is not the inventor of socialism or communism. He's the critic of socialism and communism, which were very well established ideologically and as a practical political movement already by the time Marx and Engels arrive on the scene. And Proudhon is a major thinker and inspirational leader in the socialist movement. And therefore, right, the critique of socialism is the critique of this kind of philosophy of revolution or philosophical complaint against capitalism. So misery in that sense, also that we're left with what appears to be an impoverishment of philosophy itself. So it seems like, the inspiration for radical bourgeois philosophy, that kind of revolutionary philosophy, that seems so kind of heady. It seems like a very grim situation in the 1800s. where it looks like there's a kind of stark comparison to be made between the promise of thinkers like Kant and Hegel and the reality of capitalism. And philosophy is implicated in that, right? So Marxists tend to be dismissive of philosophy for that reason. They're like, oh, philosophy is just idealism, and what about brute material reality, right? And that's not Marx's own attitude. He doesn't prioritize philosophy, but he does see philosophy as a realm of ideology and as a realm of, therefore, truth, however obscure to itself.
Okay. So I want to read a quote from the essay, and then you can kind of riff off this because I love this quote here. The original Marxist ideology critique, Marx and Engels' ideology critique of bourgeois society, was the imminent dialectical critique of the way society and capitalism necessarily appears to its members, bourgeois and proletarian, capitalists and workers alike. It was the critique of the true consciousness of the workers as well as of the capitalists. Now, that formulation just lost me 99% of ostensible Marxists, as well as all the rest of the left, whether socialists or liberal, who do indeed think that the poor, benighted workers and other subaltern need us intellectuals to tell them what their true social interests are. Could you kind of maybe unpack a little bit why you just lost 99%?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Well, false consciousness, right? This category of from Marxism and ideology critique, understood as the critique of false consciousness. It sounds very straightforward. It sounds like wrong thinking or a bad way of thinking, and ways of thinking that keep people trapped in the system. And bourgeois ideology sounds like, oh, the workers, if they believe in bourgeois ideology, then they don't recognize the true condition in capitalism. Maybe they think that they're gonna, all become rich someday, that they're either gonna win the lottery or they're gonna get lucky and invent something, and QVC will catapult them to billionaire status, or Shark Tank, will take their idea or something. And I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I think most workers know that they're never going to be rich.
Yeah.
Right.
I think I'll be honest. I think there's something to, like, we love to think about being rich, but do we actually think for real we're all going to?
No, right? And so there must be something deeper going on about bourgeois ideology and false consciousness if we assume that it's a problem for the working class. Right. So there's that aspect. And I'll just say something to the side of that, which is we might assume, but maybe incorrectly, that bourgeois ideology is true for the capitalists, but false for the workers. It may not be true for the capitalists either, right? Like, it might be just as false for the capitalists as it is for the workers. It might also be just as true for the workers as it is true for the capitalists. And so I kind of center the issue around socialism as bourgeois ideology. And, not the sort of everybody's greedy and self-interested and it's like a Darwinian struggle to survive or something like that, that kind of misanthropic view of human nature, like socialism is good as an idea, but human nature, no, right? And I just feel like, well, okay, that's one way of thinking about bourgeois ideology. The other way of bourgeois ideology is approaching bourgeois ideology is like equality of opportunity, basic rights, the freedom of the worker to enter into or quit an employment contract. Formal freedom, yeah. Which, we have to pause on that and say it's also substantial freedom, meaning we do have a freedom that the peasants didn't have, or that, medieval artisans didn't have, or even aristocrats didn't have.
Just that's one point. Like, I've seen Slavoj emphasize this many times, where he goes, "Don't think that that's not a leap forward when it comes to freedom. no, there's problems with it, but
Right.
we lose something important if we actually lost that freedom.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Right. And people can quit their jobs. They can move around the world. They can. They do. Right. And yeah, there's restrictions on movement, and there's more restrictions on movement as time goes by, which is kind of paradoxical. But there still is some, significant amount.
Is that why we're talking about techno-feudalism nowadays, is because of that?
I mean, maybe in the sense that people are being tied down more, possibly, but the thing is that, of course, you can move, but you remain like slaves to the system, and this global reach, like this kind of, I don't know, feudalism, like the rent extraction will follow you no matter where you go, right? Because it's over the internet and whatever, right? It's digitally mediated. So that might have something to do with it too. I mean, it sort of strains the metaphor. But again, what about it is true? And what if, again, it's this Hegelian notion of true and false? That, of course, in a way, we always misrecognize our condition, and we always misrecognize our freedom. And what that means is that the result of our freedom is different from how we understand it. Right. So, for instance, for Hegel, every revolution has an outcome very different from its intention, right? From its self-conception. And I think that that is also true, by the way, for the struggle for socialism. Meaning, the reason why Marx never describes what socialism or communism are going to be is that we must necessarily misrecognize it from within capitalism. Meaning, whatever we think communism is going to be is just really our projection of it from within capitalism. It's a capitalist projection on the future. And that is the consciousness through which we have to try to change the world, but it's not actually going to be according to that consciousness that the world will end up being changed.
That's good. Okay, I want to ask a couple more things related to this section in particular before we move on. In it, you make an interesting claim here that ideology is a modern phenomenon. I think a lot of Marxists and theorists in general would challenge you on that, but why do you hold that position?
Because, again, ideology is a phenomenon of contradiction for Marx. Meaning for something to be ideological, it has to be self-contradictory. And although, Hegel makes a good case for perhaps what the consciousness of the feudal aristocracy was, being self-contradictory in some way, with regard to Christianity in particular. He also says that it appears that way in hindsight. Right? So it would not be correct to say the aristocrats of the Middle Ages had ideological false consciousness, had ideology, in that they were living a self-contradiction. But again, what comes out of feudalism, bourgeois society, makes it seem like, oh, actually, the rights and duties of the aristocracy were at least in tension with, often in contradiction with, Christianity. And we have to remember also that back then, the peasants weren't particularly Christian. Right? That's why paganism refers, like, pagan means the peasants. It means the belief system of the peasants. So the peasants had their syncretic kind of holdovers from the ancient Mediterranean and also like Celtic. They had their kind of folk religion. So who were Christian? The clergy and the aristocracy. And Nietzsche's good on this. That basically the clergy used Christianity to control the aristocracy. Right? And so, right? And in other words, the aristocracy was supposed to feel guilty about their power. Right?
Yeah.
And they were supposed to be contrite about it. Right? And so, the women who went to the monastery, right, out of repentance, these are peasant women. These are aristocrats. right? That's, and that's the monastery, the convent, right? And of course, like, Socrates who were, had an existential crisis, then would, give up their warrior status and become like monks in the monastery, right? This is not peasants, no, right?
You feel
Nor
like
is it artisan.
you feel like certain people in positions of Christian power have used the Gospels. Oh, fishermen, carpenters. They seem the first Christians, the first followers of Christ are very lowly people, right? And it's like, well, we identify with
Then it
them, so
changes.
that's therefore who is primarily Christian.
Right. It's a vow of the vow of chastity doesn't really make sense for people who are already, or vow of poverty doesn't really make sense to people who are already poor, right? And so it's a kind of it's a curious history, if you think about it, right? But is it ideology? Because again, ideology would suggest not just self-deception, but some kind of fundamental falsehood. Would suggest like a self-serving, like again, like almost a hypocrisy. And again, the very notion of ideology that we have now, and Marx's notion of ideology is self-contradictory consciousness. It really applies to the working class in capitalism. It doesn't really apply much outside of that. Meaning it applies to the workers who are asserting their bourgeois rights in their class struggles, and the fact that capitalism already goes completely beyond what could ever be realized through those rights.
What would you think of like the Althusserian type of concept of ideology, where what it is the naturalization of a contingent state of affairs, which is, it's presenting the order of things as it must be this way instead of it just happened to be this way.
Well, okay, so I'm going to do something unfair with Althusser, but I think that it's actually warranted. So I will admit that I probably, like, besides the Communist Manifesto and maybe some other things when I was in high school, that in college, maybe the first thing that I read that was like rigorous Marxist theory was the Ideological State Apparatus' essay by Althusser. And St. Paul is there. And there is this kind of weird, like there's a Christian thing and there's also a Platonic thing. There's a kind of Platonist thing going on with Althusser. And I think that ultimately we learned that Althusser was motivated by ancient philosophy and pre-Socratic philosophy in terms of thinking about materialism, and also thinking about how Plato handled that pre-Socratic heritage. And I think that it is a kind of important window into understanding what Althusser was trying to work through. I'm sympathetic to Althusser insofar as he's criticizing what had happened to Marxism in the 20th century, that had become dogmatic. I'm sympathetic to that. I don't like his solution to it, though. Right. So I think that the kind of aleatory materialism of Althusser, and the kind of what we might call a kind of false hypostasization of the world, that's what he thinks ideology is, that it's a kind of self-dogmatization of the world. I think that that's, again, more of an ancient notion of the folly of thinking. It's like a kind of Platonic critique of doxa, right? That we might kind of hypostasize the appearances of the world and lose sight of changing reality.
This is really important. I think this helps clarify your position. So yeah, early on, I mean, you take the figure of Socrates. People, I mean, I understand why critical theorists and Marxists can view Socrates as, an ideal, a figure of inspiration, because what is he doing? He's challenging the doxa, the basic presupposition that his society took for granted. Now, somebody could say, well, that's ideology critique. But I think here it's important for you to say, like, no, here's the difference between simply just critiquing one's own presuppositions and ideology critique.
That's right. That's right. And also just the way that we understand being enmeshed in the world might be a little different as well. There is a kind of an ordinary sense of having a vested interest in the way things are, just by virtue of existing in the world. But I always like to say, in my academic teaching, I always like to point out the most ideological things that demand critique are claims to freedom, not claims to why the world is the way that it is, but claims about how to change it. Right. So if bourgeois philosophy is the philosophy of freedom, it's kind of revolutionary philosophy of freedom, it's precisely in the way freedom appears to us that ideology is most pernicious. Right. Rather than our kind of ordinary notion of ideology, which is a kind of ratification of reality, a justification for the way things are, the more important, acute problem of ideology would be in how we understand how we might change it. And the reason for that is because this is a revolutionary society, right? We're still living in bourgeois emancipation. We're still living in that kind of revolutionary society. And on top of that, there's also a capitalism is revolutionary. And a lot of our discontent in capitalism comes from how we experience that change. How we experience all that is solid melting into air. We experience it as liberating. More often, we experience it as oppressive. And the reason for that is that we don't see that change as our own doing, but as something imposed upon us, and really as an alien force. Meaning even the capitalists feel like they're subject to this dynamic law of change. Right. So they're just successfully riding the wave of it as opposed to the rest of us who are swamped by it. Right. And it's kind of almost a matter of luck that they're able to ride the wave or not, because they get ruined too by the revolutions in capitalism. So the trick here is not to say, oh, this is like some evil demonic force that's gripped us, gotten hold of us, and we have to end it. We also have to recognize it as something that we've unleashed. Like the other metaphor from the Communist Manifesto is the sorcerer's apprentice. Right? So it's a force that we've unleashed and that we have yet to master. And that might be, look, that might be a fantasy that we can master these forces that we've unleashed. Of course, Heidegger doesn't think that we can master these forces that we've unleashed.
Nor does Nick Land, right? Like you have your philosophers who say it's impossible.
Right. And I think that that's just straightforwardly conservative, in the sense that it's pessimistic and it's a disenchantment of our capacities for freedom, which again might be warranted, but really that might be a kind of resignation in the face of the task at hand. And also we have to, to my mind, we have to limit what that task is, meaning we can't say, oh, thousands of years of Western metaphysics, how can we ever, master that and overcome the problems of that? We have to sort of specify it more as the industrial capitalist era. It's something that's more recent. And it does implicate prior history, and prior history led to it, and it does seem to swallow up the past and kind of appropriate everything to itself. But it is a more of a specific problem. Like it's only a couple of 100 years old. It's not like thousands of years old. And Marxism is based on optimism. It is. Like this whole ideology critique thing can sound very optimistic in the sense of we can, if we're living in misrecognition, commodity fetishism, we can still do something about it. We can still work in and through it somehow. And so that's, I mentioned earlier the 19th and the 20th centuries. So I talked about the 19th century, but we can talk about the 20th century. Obviously, 20th century is the century of catastrophe. It's nuclear war, it's genocide, it's just on a scale, it just sort of encompasses the world in a profound way that, was not true before the 20th century. And therefore, there's reason to doubt, Marxism even as a revolutionary philosophy and its kind of optimism.
Okay, so the last thing I want to say about this first section, and then we'll kind of accelerate the process from here on.
Uh-huh.
You say, in short, I recognized early on that Marxism was not some better philosophy. And so maybe just kind of tease out the meaning of that just
Tease
a
out the
little bit.
meaning
I
of
mean,
that.
you kind of have, but maybe where it's a little clearer.
So all right, my own background educationally is that, this stuff is all new to me. Meaning, I did read some like Plato in high school, and I read literature. I did read the manifesto, but not even in college did I really like study philosophy. It's really, I studied political history, I studied other things. Then I kind of, in graduate school, I gave myself like a second education completely, which is to do a deep dive. And I had Adorno as a guide to learning philosophy. And, I might have read like Groundwork for Metaphysics of Morals by Kant. I might have read some Kant essays. They didn't really like hit me in college. Then I, really Kant, and I tried to teach Kant, and I do teach Kant now academically, and I realized, oh wow, there's so much here, and I had previously read like Foucault and Deleuze and Lacan, and I had read all sorts of things. I had, and I thought, oh wow, Kant was already there. He was already there, and it's just much more satisfying and kind of clear about the stakes of it all. Um, and so I thought, okay, there's really something here. And what that and that all the postmodernists famously at the end of their lives are like, yeah, we never transcended Kant. Like Foucault said that, Derrida said that. I think Deleuze has a version of that. They all have kind of versions of this, of like, we tried to surpass Kant. If they start out, they wanted to surpass Hegel, and then they're like, oh, we can't surpass Hegel. I mentioned that with Foucault. But really, they're like, we never surpassed Kant. And I'm like, okay, let's take that seriously for a second. And I don't have to wait until I'm in my 70s or 80s to realize I've spent my whole life trying to transcend Kant, but it's all actually in there in Kant. And so maybe the point is not a better philosophy. Maybe the point is thinking about what that philosophy means now. And if it is troubled in some way or challenged in some way, that's not a matter of, like, again, Kant's failure to think, but rather the reality of our world.
Yeah.
And that Marxism has been about that. It's been about not wanting to toss Kant out, not say, oh well, capitalism disproves bourgeois ideology. Capitalism disproves bourgeois philosophy. But maybe capitalism falls short of bourgeois philosophy on the one hand. It's very paradoxical, and it surpasses bourgeois philosophy on another level. So it sort of paradoxically contradicts bourgeois philosophy in these two different ways, that it sort of outstrips it, but it also kind of falls short of it. Right. So wrestling with that, like what happened to this enlightened view of humanity and the world and embrace of secular time and society, what happened to that? And why are we sunk back into mysticism in capitalism?
So, okay.
Right.
This is a good opportunity. I mean, first off, I just want to say the first thing, like the first essay that Nick Land wrote early on, is an interesting one called Kant, Capital, and the Prohibition of Incest. And this is the one that even like lefty types like this essay. And he gets at this homology where he's like, no, Kant and capital are homologous. And all he means really is Kant posits this thing in itself, this radical exteriority
Yeah.
that can't be brought
Right.
into the phenomenological system, let's say, right? Early on, he's saying, okay, so capitalism also leaves out the other, in a way homologous to Kant's thing in itself. So you can do something like that, trying to actually read Kant and capital together. But I just wanted to say that as a side note. The more interesting thing you said here was the word mysticism. This has been a word that you've been using lately in certain conversations. And Nance, I want to bring you in here too, because this is a thing beyond just this, debate you've been having, Chris. A lot of people are doing a kind of return to Plato. And you also see like a return to the Stoics. Not so much a return to Aristotle right now. I don't see that, but Chris and Nance, what do you guys think of this return to Plato?
Yeah, Nance, what do you observe? What's going on?
I mean, I'm first of all, I'm a filthy Philistine. I'm a dirty heathen. I am I'm a digital boy. I'm a 21st century digital boy. So I think there's a reactionary element to it. But larger than that, I think it is down to the failure for us, vaguely us, to live up to the responsibility that was that we realized with modernity, with Kant, with Hegel, like that was a moment where we were freed up to make the world for ourselves, and with freedom comes the responsibility to maintain that freedom. And I think because we failed. Now, why did we fail? That's the question, maybe, but I think that's what it is. I think it's because we failed, and the commodity was there to pacify us and say there is a quick and easy answer for every question you have. And so people are just searching, and they're saying, I'm not finding it here in the detritus of the destroyed future, so it must be beyond that mountain. Yeah, that's what I think it is. And again, I'm a filthy postmodern something, I don't know, but that's what I think.
Look, I want to clarify. So, okay.
Yeah.
People can go, well, yeah, am I just referring to the exchange between you and Benjamin Studebaker about Plato? No, I mean, yes, I'm referring to that. But this thing with Plato is beyond that. I mean, there's people who I see doing a return to Plato who don't even know anything about what you and Benjamin were talking about. So it is a broad thing I see
in the air
online. Yeah, it's in the air. And I guess I would just like to know, like, okay, so is this a thing with the ancients, or would you also, because you think philosophy properly begins with Kant, would this include the medieval philosophers, like and even the early moderns, the pre-Kantians? Are they just not able to provide much helpful insight into our current situation?
So first of all, I want to say, the millennial generation had its return to German idealism, mostly via Hegel, but there was also a little bit of interest in Kant as well. And that moment seems to have passed. And I think that now we're dealing with the disenchantment of bourgeois philosophy, and therefore it looks like the pre-moderns are on the table. But the broader moment for the millennials is the crisis of neoliberalism, which is also crisis of postmodernism. So if everybody's educated in postmodernism and then they look at the world around them and it sort of creepily resonates with postmodernism, they're like, oh shit, yeah, everything is kind of postmodern now. Like Hillary Clinton's a postmodernist, it's like, fuck,
Right.
And so what they go for is like, they go for the pre-modern. And for me, the question is, like Nance, you brought it up, what about the modern? right? So is the choice is not between postmodernism and pre-modernism. There's also modernism, and I'm not going to just endorse it, but we have to deal with it. And Robert Pippin, one of my teachers, he has a book called Idealism as Modernism. And the issue is modernism as this kind of philosophy of revolutionary philosophy, and we're disenchanted with the results of the revolution. We're disenchanted with the results of the American and French revolutions. We're disenchanted with the results of the revolutions of the 20th century. We're also disenchanted now with the revolutionary kind of philosophy of postmodernism that tried to be more radical than modernism, even while it kind of retreated from modernism, right? So like Habermas, thought of postmodernism as conservative. So I think that that's part of it, because for me, it's hard to separate a attraction to pre-modern philosophy from an attraction to religion. And religion is back, right? And it's back in this very peculiar way, namely, like, it's not Christian fundamentalism like Protestantism. It's like traditional Catholicism.
Yeah.
And I'll throw in a little snarky remark. Are you ready?
Okay.
I, cracked my head on Heidegger. I read books, lectures, everything, right? And then I learned that his dissertation was on Duns Scotus. And I was like, it's all fucking Duns Scotus in Heidegger, isn't it? It's the univocity of being, right? Like Heidegger never got past Duns Scotus. And, so, God speaks differently through all of his creations, but it's all one voice, right? And that's the mystery,
There's a great point there, Chris, because, like I was a Heideggerian for years, which is part of the problem with being in time and why he gave it up is we kind of he couldn't figure out how to come to the meaning of being. He has, okay, the being of equipment and the being of substances and the being of Dasein, and then he thinks about the being of works of art. What do they all have in common? He was never able to get at it.
Right. And there is part of me that thinks, okay, so it's Catholicism. That and by the way, the French fries, as I endearingly call them, the postmodernists, not the freedom fries, the French fries. That's a throwback to the era of the coalition of the willing. But I think that, one of my problems with French thought is that I have the sneaking suspicion that they're still wrestling with Catholicism. There's a whole theory of representation, and it's like, ooh, wait, you're still struggling with idolatry, huh? You read Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, it's isn't he talking about the church? Baudrillard for sure, right? For sure. Deleuze for sure, right? And I just feel like these are all people who are one step out of Catholic school, And so it tickles me that I was raised Catholic. I'm a WAP, I'm a Mick, right? I'm Irish and Italian. And J.D. Vance, Appalachian, legacy American, right? Converted to Catholicism? I'm like, wow.
Aren't you supposed to be a Baptist?
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, maybe the know nothings had a point. With the papists. These were the Whigs who were anti-immigrant in the era before the Civil War. And so because I mean, I don't know, I'm fine. Catholicism is fine, don't get me wrong. But I do think, the church was overthrown. I do. And, and I think that the right wingers, the traditional Catholics, I think that they're more honest about this than the left is sometimes.
So, Chris, are you saying that Plato is diet caffeine free Catholicism?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's true. So it's kind of like Plato through medieval Catholicism is what we have.
I mean, Augustine, cements that, right?
Yeah. And and obviously there's, I mean, that I've had this debate with Benjamin Studebaker, and he's like, don't be a Thomist. And it's like, be a Platonist, not an Aristotelian. Thomas Aquinas. And I'm like, okay, like, again, this to me means a total disenchantment of modernity. And I don't think we can afford to do that. We gotta deal with capitalism.
So for you, the goal is to be more modern than the modernist?
Or, I'm not going to say modernism either, because, I'm a Frankfurt School person, so I think of modernism as symptomatic. And I think that postmodernism remained modernism. I also think that attempts at pre-modernism remain modernism, just sort of deceiving themselves about it. That we're all doing this within capitalism. I think that I mentioned that in the essay, that everything is bourgeois ideology now, including atavism, including like fundamentalist religion of whatever kind, Islamic fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, this weird civilizationalism like Dugin, or like this weird like Judaism is not a religion, it's a civilization, if you've heard of that. And it's like, damn, I think that this is reactionary modernism. That's what it is. It might tell itself that it's rejecting modernity, but it's still doing it from within modernity. Meaning, these are people who are telling themselves freedom is a lie, but they are free people telling themselves that freedom is a lie. Because we are free. For better or for worse, we're emancipated. And we got to deal with that. And yes, we're in another kind of dimension now, but it's not like a lie that we're emancipated from traditional civilization. We are. Again, for better or for worse.
So if we could put them in the DeLorean and gun it to 88 and take them back to the 12th century, would they be dying to get back here?
I think that they wouldn't really recognize what's going on. Like, they wouldn't know. They
Because
wouldn't
the
be able
12th
to
century
exist.
doesn't match their fantasy of the 12th century?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
These are bourgeois subjects who are disenchanted with bourgeois society, bourgeois modernity, and bourgeois freedom. And I'm not going to say that we shouldn't be encountering a contradiction in bourgeois freedom. I am a Marxist, which means that I think that bourgeois freedom has become contradictory in capitalism. It has. But that doesn't mean that it was always contradictory. That doesn't mean that, if it's a lie now in certain substantial ways, that doesn't mean it was always a lie. Right. So I think that's really the issue. And again, yeah, Plato being in the air, I've always had this sneaking suspicion, that even Kant and Hegel were being turned into traditional philosophers, meaning they were being turned into like a metaphysical foundation. And, there's a temptation to do that. I don't think it's true to it, right? But I understand why that might happen. And another way of thinking about it would be we could always reify Kant and Hegel. We could always, Now, I did want to say something about the thing in itself.
Okay. Okay, since you're going to talk about the thing in
yeah.
itself, this is just like a little, I just have to say it. So it's so interesting to me, having all these conversations, having gotten to know so many of you, the different theorists, and you and the Nick Land and Žižek and Todd McGowan, and so many. There's one thing all you agree on. Kant's a fucking genius. I have yet to go meet anybody who goes, oh, Kant ain't shit. Nobody does this. And so I just feel like I want to take a moment to say it's a testament to how amazing of a philosopher Kant was.
That's true. Yeah. Now, I will say, when I was younger, there's Kant and there's Kant. Meaning, I think that with neo-Kantianism at the end of the 1800s and the early 20th century, something has happened to Kant that's very specific. Namely, Kant is reduced to the first critique. and then the other aspects of his thought are kind of hived off, so that he's like an epistemologist, and he might be like an ethicist. Like that's how his moral philosophy is
But
understood.
that third critique.
The third critique, though, is so important, and of course that's the Kant that I teach. And that is the completion of the Kantian system. It's about freedom, very explicitly. I mean, so is the practical philosophy, but still, it gives some substance to it. And I do believe that later German idealism, like Hegel's, based on the third critique. And right, that's for me only the full Kant is the full Kant. But I do think that it is the case that he tends to be reduced to epistemology. And then I can understand why people would find Kant boring. If it's just first critique Kant. Although a lot of it is there in the first critique. I mean, it's why, in some ways he has to anticipate a lot. But I can understand that reducing, and also analytic philosophy has this quality to it of reducing philosophy to like logical conditions of epistemology. And so, so they will dispute Kant, but they're basically doing some kind of first critique kind of epistemology question, reducing philosophy to that.
I'll just say, trying to get you, Nick Land, Slavoj Žižek, Heidegger, trying to get you all on the same page on anything is nearly impossible. But it is Kant's the one thing.
Yeah.
And don't you
It's
wish
possible.
though?
That's right.
I know the problem would just be how big the book. I always felt like, God, I wish the three critiques could just come as one book, where it's
maybe. I mean, they're very different texts, though. They read differently. I feel like the first critique reads very like logically, and the third critique is more discursive. The second critique is also more discursive than the first critique. So it's they are different. It's almost like it's different. The three Hegel are different. Phenomenology, science of logic, and philosophy of right are also, in terms of prose, pretty different.
Yeah. You want to say something on the thing in itself?
I did want to say something about that because I think that I teach epistemology to social workers, practicing psychotherapists, in a PhD program. And because of that, I have to sorts of ways of getting kind of regular working adult people interested in like philosophy and epistemology, right? And Kant ends up being brought up by several of the readings. So like Karl Popper brings up Kant, and the thing in itself problem, I think, is peculiar because it can be turned into Kant's assertion of what we cannot know. And I don't think that that's really the point of it. I think the point of it is what we can know and how we know it. Meaning, to say that we don't know things in themselves doesn't mean that we don't really know them, right? So it's not a restatement of Plato, a noumena phenomenon, right? Like it's not that. It's really something else, which is to say that we know things, but we also can change how we know things. So any way that we know things is not a once and for all proposition. And so the thing in itself is like a kind of endless possibility of knowing. It's not a limit of lack of knowing. It's not that sort of
that's interesting. I heard Todd
knowledge.
McGowan and Ryan Ingley on their podcast, Why Theory. They read The Transcendental Aesthetic, and they had an episode on that recently. And they were talking about Henry Allison's reading of Kant. Is that a reading that resonates with you? Because the way they describe that interpretation of Kant seems very, very
Similar.
much akin to what you're saying.
I think I mean, I've been influenced. I have been influenced. But I also think it's just there in the Kant.
Okay.
I think that it's also the question of subjectivity. So I will also say something about that. There's a disenchantment with subjectivity, meaning we are more impressed by the limits of our subjectivity than by the capacities of our subjectivity. And Kant is very much about the capacities of our subjectivity. He's not interested in drawing limits to our subjectivity. Quite the contrary. I think that today we're predisposed to be impressed by and therefore find accounts for the limits to our subjectivity. And so, and I think that that's been the case for a long time, right? So I don't want to peg this to neo-Kantianism exactly, but you can already see a change. And also the relationship between science and philosophy is very different than it was for Kant himself, for Hegel. And we tend to think, oh, well, they're like old-fashioned, and it's Liebes philosophy, it's some kind of romantic or nature philosophy. And I think, well, no, actually, they had a healthier understanding of the relationship between science and philosophy, whereas now we've kind of accepted this kind of aporia between them. And it's not that we can fix that, but we should stop and think, oh, is it an accident that that happened during capitalism? Which we'll get to our later subject. We'll like keep that in mind when we start talking about technology,
Okay.
because it's important.
Okay. So basically, throughout the rest of the essay, I mean, I think maybe one of the main things to talk about is, okay, so there's the section ends, and then there's authoritarianism, history, impossibility, metaphysics, and finally overcoming. So, because I want to have time to talk to you about these other things, maybe we can talk about the ends, and then maybe you can get us to overcoming from that discussion. Yeah. So
All right,
again,
so
when we talk about ends, I mean, different
Mhm.
words come to mind. Saying satisfaction. So are we talking about the satisfaction of philosophy, the goal of philosophy, the conclusion of philosophy, the completion of philosophy, the achievement of philosophy? What's going on here?
Or the termination of philosophy, because you could
There you go.
also look at it that way. You could say, okay, we're done with philosophy, right? That we're just doing like empirical science now,
Mhm.
like Hume,
Yeah.
or the way we normally think about science. So yes, so what is the goal of philosophy? Kant said so, Hegel said so, Heidegger said so, that the philosophical question is freedom. Being the task of philosophy, the aim of philosophy, the goal of philosophy is to explain our freedom, account for our freedom. And it- now there's different ways of thinking about that too, right? Which is to say, understand our freedom, realize our freedom. Maybe philosophy is supposed to help us be free. So I would say that that's the end of philosophy, the aim, the goal of philosophy, especially modern philosophy, especially starting with Kant and Hegel. It is to recognize and also help achieve, realize our freedom. And in some ways that's infinite, right? So that's not something that ever stops. But there is the question of philosophy per se, like the Y ending, like the metaphysical category of philosophy. Like, why don't we have philosophies? What do we mean when we say we have philosophy? That kind of pluralism of like postmodernism. You just pluralize things and that liberates them.
Mhm.
And I talk about that because my other professor, Moishe Postone, talked about that. He talked about postmodernism as a kind of premature post-capitalism that tries to like wave a magic wand and get rid of the capital S subject and just give us the small s subjects. And it's like, yeah, but maybe we still live under the domination of the capital S subject, capital, right? In which case, it's appropriate for us to talk about a metaphysics of society, however, as something to be overcome, as something that dominates us, not as something that we want to realize, but something that we want to overcome. Asterisk, maybe we want to realize it too, meaning we want to realize capitalism, right? We don't just want to blow it up or tear it down or try to undo it, right? So I think that, again, especially thinking about freedom, the task of philosophy is peculiar. And we also have lived under the specter of the termination of philosophy, meaning have we lost the capacity to do philosophy in the way that either the ancients did it or the moderns. Right? So are we yearning to be able to think, have wisdom in the way that it seems like the ancients were able to do, and it also seems like the moderns were able to do? And I talk about this in my introductory remarks to the essay when I gave it as a presentation, which is, okay, so philosophers, are they all like dead white males? Are they like, privileged people? And I will also say that, there is this idea that in the ancient world, you needed leisure to do philosophy, so you needed other people to labor. And those who labored couldn't be philosophers because they didn't have the time or the energy to do it. And so is the idea now that, likewise, we're only going to be able to be philosophers when we overcome the need to labor, right? So the ancients had a very straightforward understanding of philosophy and labor being counterposed, that you had to be free of labor in order to be able to philosophize. Well, Kant and Hegel are not like that, and Marx certainly isn't like that. Meaning, it's not freedom from labor, but freedom in and through labor that philosophy is trying to comprehend. That, and also, Kant famously said that Rousseau taught him that he didn't have the right to think of himself as more intelligent than a common day laborer, and that the task of philosophy was not to tell people what they didn't know, but explain to them what they already know. Right? And
that's a great, I just got to, that's a great distinction, because what is at the heart of it is there is a universal, we're all on the same level here. It's, it too. I'm not, I don't have some sublime status because I'm
right.
the authority with a capital A.
Right.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and that's the bourgeois ethos of it. There is this egalitarianism and this, humanism, really, which is that, maybe not everyone is a philosopher, but everyone could potentially be a philosopher, and everyone is kind of doing philosophy in some way. Hegel has it like we live in a philosophical world where we all have to think about, reflect upon what we're doing in a way that, again, peasants and aristocrats didn't, right? Or traditional craftspeople didn't have to reflect on what they're doing and why they're doing it and how it fits into society. Uh, they didn't have to, and they didn't. And whereas we have to, and the optimism is that we all more or less do. Now, okay, 2026, is everybody a philosopher? It gets to an issue that we brought up earlier, maybe, Nance, you mentioned like xenofeminism and like this kind of thing, right? And alienation. Okay, what if we live in a world where not only is not everyone a philosopher, no one is a philosopher. Meaning, Heidegger is not a philosopher the way Kant was. He couldn't be a philosopher the way Kant was. And certainly, I will just, as if I need to say this, academics are not philosophers. Like, academia is so anti-intellectual. It's so hostile to thinking. My God. No fucking way. Right? Right?
No, don't you agree? Like this kind of, whether we call it underground or para academia, whatever it is, isn't there this more philosophical than being stuck in an institution trying to do philosophy? I mean, I just see so many people who have that real philosophical impulse come out here to do it, because they
Yeah.
can't do it there.
There's no institutional space for it. I mean, what I'll say is this. Me and my friends have joked about this. We're academics, and we started recognizing this and joking about it when we were in grad school. And when I teach graduate students, I always kind of jostle with them a little bit on this, which is, learning is for undergrads. Meaning, graduate school is not about education, it's about professionalization. And professionalization is the opposite of education. It's learning to talk the talk. It's learning the discourse.
But
right? And that's so
being a
wrong.
philosopher, isn't it part
Right.
of what's essential to that is you never stop learning in a robust way?
Exactly. Right. And nominally, being a scholar means being a lifelong student. In practice, though, no. Right. And it's because of the way knowledge production is handled now. And the reason for that is not because of any particular institutional faults, but because the purpose of knowledge in society is unclear. Right? It's not motivated. Right? So we don't allow ourselves to philosophize, let alone have institutions that facilitate it. But also at an individual level, it seems like something that we can't afford, or we can only do it in this kind of trippy way. I mean, I also have an art background, so I'm going to confess that. So when I encounter like philosophy brain, when I encounter like philosophy debates and philosophy as an academic discipline, I'm just like, oh my God, no way. And that's because for me, there's like a pleasure to speculative thinking and new ways of thinking, new forms of reflecting on thinking that I hadn't considered before. And maybe I approach philosophy aesthetically, I don't know. But again, I feel like I'm on pretty solid ground with Kant and Hegel on that one. Right? Uh, and yet philosophy has become very grim. It's become formalized in a way that seems to violate the spirit of philosophy. So often I'll be accused of not doing philosophy because I'm just talking about philosophy. And then I'm like, okay, but what's your model for doing philosophy? Is it this kind of analytic logic chopping? Because that's not doing philosophy to my mind either, right? Like kind of logically talking about philosophy, right? It's like analyzing somebody else's argument, analyzing somebody else's thought, but without actually thinking, And so it's a little maddening what I find, and so I think that's, and again, for me, I wonder about the larger context for that. I don't just think, oh, people are failing to do certain things in a certain way. I think, okay, what about conditions makes it so that it's not just constrained, but again, unmotivated. People shrink back. And I don't know, Adorno has a great phrase for this, the classificatory urge, that what you're doing is just sort of slotting things in. It's like, well, that's Kantian, that's Hegelian, that's Nietzschean. You're just sort of classifying things and, putting them into, pigeonholing them so that you don't have to think about them anymore. It's just sort of pattern recognition. You're
Isn't
just
that
sort
kind of
of
like a defense mechanism against philosophy?
right. I mean, the thing that I'll say about academia, I've encountered this in the art world and in the social theoretical world and in the philosophical world. I think that many people become academic scholars of subjects that they hate, that they're deeply hostile to. In other words, that art historians, will study art because they really hate it. And so what they do is they intellectually master it as a defense against it.
That's interesting.
I mean, this is like, we're getting very deep now, right?
Yeah.
But the other thing is, like Marxism, what I've discovered in my lifetime is that I'm just like, why are people interested in Marxism? Every Marxist that I ever encountered seemed like they were fending off Marxism, that their Marxism was actually a defense mechanism against Marxism. And I just thought, fuck, like, what's wrong with me? that I'm not dealing with things this way, that I'm not, doing this intellectual defense mechanism or intellectualizing as a defense mechanism. It could be because I have the art background, right? Where I'm not just
So it's art that made you the last Marxist.
Yes, indeed it is. Because there's going to be a third book, by the way, of my art writings.
Awesome.
There's going to be a third book of my art writings where I am going to bring home this idea that maybe my sensibility in the way that I approach these things is actually born of the fact that I have this background in art.
Hey, I think it's a happy little hat tip to Kant that the third book will be about art.
Yes, it will be like the third critique. Exactly. Right, exactly. It's because again, I also think that, just to use a Kantian category, from the third critique, not everything is logical, not everything is conceptual, not everything is about the understanding. That often it's about sensibility, feeling, and judgment. And can we deal with things at that level, at the level of intuitive reason, as not irrational, but as a form of reason, synthetic reason? Can we deal with things at that level? There are things that we know that cannot be explained logically, and yet we know them.
Don't you think too many philosophers underestimate that emotional intelligence actually is intelligence?
Of course. Yeah, obviously. And clearly the analytic tradition, is bad on that one. But the continental tradition has also not fared much better on it.
Okay. So before we move on to technology and the rest of the stuff, can you talk about the conclusion part? Like, what does it mean to overcome?
To overcome. All right. So again, I'm guided by Adorno in these things. And so he said a couple of things about Kant and Hegel that I think are important. One was that Hegel as Kant come into his own. And that means, maybe a qualitative change. It sounds like a more robust, substantial Kant. But then he also said Hegel accepted an academic definition of philosophy that was foreign to Kant. In other words, Kant was still like an old school philosopher in the kind of humanistic sense, whereas Hegel was, for instance, like a historian of philosophy in the way that we can recognize in the modern disciplines. That often a philosophy department, it's not really doing philosophy, it's doing the history of philosophy. And that Hegel already marks that change, right? And meaning that there's both a sort of filling in of Kant and there's a kind of narrowing of what philosophy itself is. And so the reason that I bring that up is that in capitalism, philosophy seems to have been overcome, but in a negative sense, in its kind of deleterious sense. And yet there's something about that overcoming of philosophy that also tells us what the goal is, even if we only have a perverse version of it in capitalism. So there's formal philosophy. So to say Kant began philosophy and Hegel completed it is to say that maybe we don't need a formal philosophy beyond Hegel. And maybe beyond capitalism, we will even go beyond the formalized philosophy of Hegel. So maybe we don't need a formal philosophy beyond Hegel in capitalism. And maybe beyond capitalism, we won't have a formalized philosophy at all. Right, so that's the question. Because, again, Kant's notion of explaining common sense, in other words, if you want an analysis of common sense, then that's what he's going to do as a specialized thinker, as a philosopher. But then Hegel has this kind of romantic overlay about like the history of philosophy. So there's like a meta character to it that isn't quite there with Kant yet. And that, maybe that suggests that overcoming capitalism will overcome the need for the way we formalize philosophy. And that's an overcoming of philosophy in another sense. Meaning you could say, okay, when does philosophy begin? Formal philosophy, of course, it doesn't begin with Kant. It begins with Plato. And
Or you could even argue maybe even more so with Aristotle, with how he formalizes logic.
yes, that's right. No, that's exactly right. Yeah, no, that's right. So back to Plato and Aristotle, definitely, right? Even though, like, interestingly, you could say Aristotle becomes undialectical. You could say Plato is the dialectic in the ancient dialogical sense, and that Aristotle abandons that.
Well, he's a substance,
Kind of.
substance metaphysician. So
Absolutely, that's right, exactly. Now, so history of philosophy. So Plato and Aristotle to Kant and Hegel, and that is capitalism holding us back from a new philosophy? Maybe, but we should also entertain the idea that maybe we won't be doing formal philosophy at all, not in the traditional sense and not in the modern revolutionary sense either. And that's where the question of metaphysics comes in, and that the debate that I was having with other members of Platypus that gave birth to this essay was the question of philosophy as metaphysics. And so it's a question of traditional metaphysics versus modern metaphysics, or post-metaphysical philosophy, which is still metaphysical, meaning you don't throw out metaphysics, but you put them on a new foundation. So Kant. And you recognize the substance differently. So the substance is not eternal, but is historical. Right? But that perhaps, again, that bourgeois revolutionary philosophy, maybe we're going to overcome a metaphysics of society, a metaphysics of labor. So one of Marx's earliest writings, his critique of Hegel, was to say Hegel's dialectic is a metaphysics of labor. Now, again, most Marxists would say, okay, the goal of socialism is to realize labor. I think it's pretty clear that the point is to overcome labor. Labor as a social relation, labor as a social metaphysics, not work, right? Not like transformative activity, but the idea of one overarching metaphysics for all of that kind of activity, right? Reducing everything that we do to labor, which is, again, emancipatory in one sense with bourgeois society, that it's kind of equalized, that we can recognize that everyone is doing something commensurate to what everyone else is doing, that it's not a caste system. But maybe we can overcome the freedom of the emancipation of labor itself. And maybe capitalism is already suggesting that. It's already suggesting that there is a form of emancipation beyond the universalization and emancipation of labor and the recognition of all human activity as labor.
awesome.
Right. So that's the task. And it might be frustrating and underspecified. And I'm always aware of the fact that when we think these things, we tend to think back to before everything was labor, when all activity was heterogeneous. And so maybe that's what we're going to return to. And I think it will probably be something yet again different from that. Right.
Great. Okay. Before we move on to these other topics, Nance, I want to check in with you. You got any questions or thoughts, reflections on this?
I mean, yeah, I could go on and on and on all night. But I think one thing, the thing that's jumping out at me the most, earlier today, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's really into Ricoeur. Shout out Adam. And like we were going back and forth about, a universal, what could we do? And talking about Ricoeur. And I was like, yeah, but you don't need to read Ricoeur. That's in Hegel. That's in Kant. Like going back to that. And I guess ultimately for me, it's looking forward. And since we don't know what's forward, what's out ahead of us, it is this impossible thing. It's this unknowable thing. Looking for an external validator or an external justificatory principle that classifies us. Just as we want to classify everything,
Yeah.
we yearn to be classified
Yep.
ourselves. I think like it's that, like that's what we're already free from, but it's so terrifying. We keep looking for a new
Yes.
cosmic
Yes.
classifier. So, and yeah, I
That's
think
right.
that is the point of all of this thinking, where we have to not understand a new way to like, we're free, we're already free, and once we can
Yep.
come to terms with that, then we can get to the new problems, such as technology and what is it doing
Uh-huh.
to us. So
Uh-huh.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
but I think this is a great a really great piece, and it's short-ish, but there's a
Yeah.
lot in there. Like, I could go on all night. So
And I do think if somebody, if you want to start with, like, I want to start with an introduction to Chris Cutrone. This is a great essay to do.
Oh, good.
yeah,
Absolutely.
I'm
So,
glad.
and okay. So this question, so Nick Land, he uses this term techonomics. Okay. He'll also develop terms like teleoplexy and all that, but techonomics, it's smashing together technology and economics. And for Nick, his form of accelerationism has always argued that technological dynamism, not technology, he understands that humans had tech before capital got here, but what we think of as this constant flow and production of new and more advanced forms of technology, for him is spurred on by capital accumulation. And that
Mhm.
technological dynamism is capitalist economics.
Mhm.
And so, look, this question I've been thinking about land, and look, I'll just cards on the table. I think, like, right now, yeah, like, that's a very fair point to, and position to hold, that you can't pry tech development away from capital. Now,
No, right.
the left accelerationists that influence me, and I mean, this is something too, I think just comes out of the Marxist tradition, is
Mhm.
that, okay, but it's possible to pry them apart. That if you're coming from more of like a traditional Marxist socialist perspective, it's, look, there's actually ways that capital hinders the development of technology, and a socialist economy, a communist economy would actually let loose an even greater form of productivity that capital can't pull off. Nick's response to that would be, yeah, and that's just a vision in the sky. It hasn't
Hmm.
ever happened. What we've
Hmm.
seen concretely is that capital is what spurs on tech development, and so left accelerationists like Peter Wolfendale, he would just say, no, I don't even think now that economics and technology are as intertwined as Nick thinks. And Peter would want to emphasize how capitalism actually holds back tech
Yes.
development.
Yes.
Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams with, Inventing the Future and the Accelerationist Manifesto, they too. So this is a thing in left accelerationism. The Xenofeminist Manifesto is in line with this. So I want to ask you, where do you stand? Like, is it possible to pry some, intense form of technological dynamism away from capital?
Well, it may not be possible for us now
Mm-hmm.
under capitalism, but let's hope that it is. So, just to like maybe at a basic level clarify things. So, we're dealing with like degrowth Marxism now also. And there's always anarcho-primitivism, and I will raise these things not as like just pejoratives. Like, I'm not trying to bring up like a caricature. I'm saying that's an authentic impulse, right? That's a genuine way of being discontented and thinking about, you know, alternatives to capitalism. It is. So there's more and less technology, basically. A quantitative consideration. So when we say capitalism is holding back technology and will unleash it and we'll have more technology and greater technology, the danger there is that I think that what really the prognosis would be is a qualitative transformation rather than a quantitative increase or a quantitative decrease, meaning getting off the treadmill of capital, you know. So, I mean, there were fellow students of Moishe Postone in graduate school with me who like really didn't understand Moishe's work. It was like really frustrating, but they wanted to, and they wanted to be Marxist. And they said something like, it's good that we didn't overcome capitalism in the early 20th century, because then we would not have all the technology that we have now. Right? Because they misconstrued. Moishe had a critique of technology, very much in line with the 60s and with others like Marcuse, the critique of technology in capitalism and the critique of the form of growth that we have in capitalism. So rather than like more growth versus less growth, what about a qualitative change in how we even think about growth?
Yeah.
Right. So, maybe it's not going to be like explosive population growth. Maybe it's not going to be degrowth of population. Maybe it's going to be a qualitative change in like how we experience life, how we, value life, how, like there are other possibilities, but it tends to confront us as more or less, as a quantitative alternative. And I think that rather we should think about it qualitatively. So we are constrained, but it's distorted in capitalism. It's sort of deformed in capitalism. And this goes to both science and technology. So science are inquiry, technology are kind of practical, not just implementation, but exploration, because often technology actually can go beyond science. Science can go beyond technology, but often technology can go beyond science. What I'm impressed by of the last like 200 years of capitalism, like since the first industrial revolution, I think that a lot of technology has been abandoned without fulfilling its potential. That's what I think. That capitalism discards technology prematurely without fully realizing its possibility.
Look, I mean, the go-to example, the light bulb that could last 80 years or whatever.
So my examples are also like a little bit sentimental or something, and they're very much of my generation. So, they had, when I was a kid, they had the Concorde, they had supersonic transport, and it was pretty cool. And then they've tried to reinvent supersonic transports now for like commercial airlines, and they've found that they can't pull it off now the way they do. And so materials technology like is just lacking. Or the space shuttle. The space
Yeah.
shuttle. They can't reinvent the space shuttle. We just can't do what they could do in the 70s anymore. And you would think, oh, well, surely we have better technology now than then. Well, not really. And that should make us stop and think that it's not like there's been technological or even scientific progress in capitalism. There's been a kind of churn, but that doesn't mean progress.
Do you think, like we've talked about it before, just real quick, Nance, like, okay, we were telling you about exocapitalism. They say that the fundamental tendency of capital is to lift away from robotics, hardware, concrete materiality in that sense. I mean, is there a case to be made that this inability to make technologies that we once had, is there a case to say, yeah, maybe there is something to this lift thing they're talking about, that actually capital does lift away from that?
You mean it abstracts from the concrete or dematerializes?
Yeah.
I mean, there are many ways that we've been thinking about that collectively in the crisis of neoliberalism. So, like, I think it's Peter Thiel has one way of thinking about that. Like, we've traded atoms for bits, right? I think that's Thiel. I don't know. It might be someone else who says that too, but
It's a good line.
it's a good line, right? And that in a more kind of direct sense, that we're not getting more efficient and economical and profitable about making things, but just in making money off money. That's like funny money, basically. Um, there is a point to that. There is. Except there obviously still has been technological development. And there has been scientific development, maybe more questionably. But it's going in different directions. Without us being able to say that it's really progress or good, because again, we're more impressed by how things are constrained and distorted, how we get this kind of funny version of things. Like, for instance, medicine. I'll just bring up anecdotally. So between my mother and her husband and my father, who's divorced from my mother, there have been like 6 rounds of cancer, all successfully cured.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, it's inarguable they've gotten better at curing cancer.
Yeah.
Than like 20 years ago. Right? Now, it's buku money. There's, and it's a factory. Like my mother complains, she's like, oh yeah, you just feel like you're in a factory. You're in this cancer care factory. And it annoys her, but nonetheless, they cured her. And yeah, it's about money, and it's you're just on a conveyor belt of care, but also it works. So it's kind of like, all right, now, so we definitely went in those kinds of directions. Like, we've concentrated on like medicine in a way that wasn't quite the same in the mid 20th century. So again, I want to be careful about the way I think and talk about these things. Right? And I want to say that the service economy, the information economy, there's the care economy. Like, we've had all this language for thinking about new forms of labor, is the way that I would put it. New forms of labor, new forms of activity. So we've decided as a society we want people to be not making cars, but taking care of people in hospitals. Okay, that's cool. It's not like we stopped making cars. We just need fewer people to make cars. But we need more people to care for people in hospitals.
What do you think? Nick says one of the biggest AI industries will be the care bot, even above the sex bot.
It could very well be. I mean, I had some health crisis like 6 years ago, and I'm still kind of mentally scarred from it. And what I was really mentally scarred by was my experience of medicine. So I had never had to deal with medicine, and then dealing with it, I was like, oh, this is just beguiling. Like, you never get a straight answer. The doctors never seem to know anything. It just seemed really weird. And so, of course, I think
Kafka-esque.
surely, yeah, it is a little bit like that, but surely, like, these doctors are overworked and they only know so much. And it is like a lot of it's accidental, and you have to take charge of your own care. You have to do your own research and bring things up with the doctor, call their attention to things. And it's like, wait, I thought that the doctor's there to do that. No, you have to do it. And so that makes me think, okay, if I have to search through the internet to ask my doctor the right questions in order to get the proper diagnosis,
which
surely
can also
AI
piss
can
them
just
off.
do that. Right, you can piss them off too. But they were good sports about it. I mean, the thing is, they were, pretty sober about it, and they were good. They care.
But to your point,
Right?
yeah,
But they
maybe
just
this
didn't
is
know.
better if AI does this.
Maybe it's better if AI does it, right? And maybe doctors are going to be in the position of like overseeing the AI, meaning the AI won't determine it. The AI will offer possibilities, and then a human will have to make a judgment call about like what the AI spits out.
Okay, Nance, I want to say real quick,
yeah.
because you had something to say. I don't want
Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
just on the healthcare note, I think healthcare is ideology.
Well, there's that problem. No, I mean, look, I'm willing to say, what do we even mean by health?
Yeah.
I am willing to they bring in a qualitative set of criteria and say, okay, not just living longer. Like, we have a very narrow notion of health. I know that for sure.
Yeah. I also think it's interesting that Cuba developed it has continuously done amazing things with healthcare. I mean, Cuba's known for doctors. And they developed the lung cancer vaccine under the blockade and all this stuff. But yeah, I think we have had some advancements in healthcare, but I think ultimately it serves the the perfect image of what we see on the Trudentia commercial. Like every fucking commercial is a prescription medication now.
Oh no, that's really crazy. So I still watch broadcast TV, and it is maddening how many pharmaceutical commercials there are. And I'm like a very suggestible person, like psychologically. Like there's something wrong with me where I am a hypochondriac, and so I like am wondering whether I have the illness that the drug applies to. Like in other words, I need a parental lock like on the TV, like preventing me from seeing this shit. No, it's crazy, right? And they always have the most insidious jingles, the earworm stuff is like gets in there, right? So I do think it brings me to the point of like a psychotic break, like if I see one more pharmaceutical commercial. So, for real. And I mean, I joke with my students, like I teach Marxism 101. So what do I teach them? I say, okay, and I say I had like a health crisis. And so what happens is you go in and basically the threshold of how sick you are is, can you still work?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think actually that's very sensible, right? Because being ill in a way that prevents you from working is more catastrophic than being ill in a way that you could still drag yourself to work. That's true, right?
Wouldn't it be nice if it was, are you healthy enough to travel? Are you healthy enough to vacation with your family? That's a commensurate measure.
Right. And I mean, look, we live in a culture where people are aware of quality of life issues. They are, right? So it's not just being a robot on an assembly line, right? It's not as grim as that.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, there is, I'm just willing to say we have a narrow notion of health and life that we ought not to naturalize too much.
Yeah.
And
I think that kind of the space shuttle and the Concorde, like those were advancements that came from, I don't know, gregarious. I mean, maybe you could say it was the Cold War,
sure.
but then where there's
we still have military stuff.
Yeah, but the incentives for that, there was exploration and discovery. And
there was like an excessive character to it, right?
Yes.
There was like, fuck, we're just going to do it because we can.
Yes. And now everything has to be justified on the ledger. Everything has to prove a return on investment. And yeah, I don't think there's been real breakthroughs or developments since maybe the 80s, maybe, or maybe that's my nostalgia. I don't know, but
no, I mean the stuff that we associate with the 80s was all developed in the 60s and 70s,
right?
And so I do think that there was, we've gotten more austere.
Yes.
The neoliberal era has been an era generally of austerity, and I always like to bring up non-Marxist, post-Marxist, para-Marxist kind of accounts. So like Daniel Bell, influenced by the Frankfurt School, he's the end of ideology guy. He wrote in the late 60s and 70s, coming of post-industrial society. And it's like quasi-Marxist. He's like, okay, so it's no longer the class struggle, it's no longer labor and capital, but it's the sociologizing logic of society versus the economizing logic of society. Which is a kind of restatement of, forces and relations of production. But he's saying this society is bringing people together, but only according to a kind of economic efficiency model. And that's the new contradiction. And that was in a period, he formulated that in the period of growth, of prosperity, abundance, the 30 years after World War II. And I don't think that it quite matches what we've faced in the neoliberal era. I think that it would be nice if we could say we have this tension between economic efficiency and what you're calling like a kind of social, right, imperative. in capitalism. And in fact, we're more impressed by how capitalism is like desocializing us, in fact. But nonetheless, the economic efficiency part, that seems to be true. Like the economizing logic. Now, at the same time, don't we want to economize? Don't we want to like get the most for the least? Don't we want like extreme efficiency? I saw Yanis Varoufakis gave a speech at it was like a quasi Davos type thing, right? It was like some like
This is in
capitalist investor.
Dubai, the UAE or the Dubai
It might have been
conference?
in Dubai.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It was like that, and he was like, "Look, capitalism is not profit motive." And he said it's not profit motive because the profit motive is like age old, meaning trying to get more out than you put in. And he said you could think of organic life itself as driven by the profit motive, right? And so, chlorophyll is driven by the profit motive. Like your essay about the sun, excess of the sun,
Yep.
right? Like, are we making use of all the energy of the sun? No, of course not, right? And I just thought this is really important, right? Because we're not talking about just profit motive, and we're not talking about just economic efficiency that way. We're talking about a specific form of that and a specific mode of what we consider efficiency. Like, what is efficiency? And it generally is about labor. And again, if we were to qualitatively transcend the way technology and labor are harnessed to each other in capitalism, I think one of the ways that I put it in another essay, I think, is that labor holds back technology and technology holds back labor. Meaning we have the labor that we have that fits technology. We have the technology we have because it fits labor. But imagine if we were to uncouple them. Right? It's the way they're tied in capitalism. That's the problem.
Okay. Here's to kind of bring it back to where we started. Nick would say MCM prime as an incentive structure spurs on the development of C prime. And he's the first theorist I know that talks about C prime, but what he means by that is technological dynamism, capability enhancement, and that the commodity isn't just a commodity, it's the technological refinement and augmentation of technological capability. And so his argument to Marxists and left accelerationists would be, you guys want to spur on not only this level of technology, but more. But you don't want this incentive structure. What is the virtual mechanism, the incentive structure that replaces MCM prime? And Peter Wolfendale, as a left accelerationist, says, yeah, this is something that we can't brush under the rug. There has to be a theorization of an alternative virtual incentive structure to replace capital. Now, for you, is this something that we theorize into existence, or is it something that would have to take hold on its own because we didn't theorize MCM prime into existence?
Existence. Right. So, I mean, I'm very old-fashioned. And I assume that if the workers were to take power, that they would want to reduce socially necessary labor time.
Yeah.
Right. They would want to reduce the amount that they have to work. And so the question is, how is capitalism already doing that, but in a pejorative sense, in the negative sense, or deleterious sense of throwing people out of work? Right. So the way that I've written about it in Marxism and Politics is robots in sweatshops. So capitalism always has both. So it always has unemployed people and overworked people. and that the result of technology and automation in this tied system of labor and technology is to produce robots and sweatshops, and you never have one without the other. So to me, that like contradiction of unemployment and overwork suggests that if the workers were in charge, they'd want to equalize labor. And equalizing labor would raise the question of a more qualitative level of what do we even need people to be doing, right? So Marx's formulation of turning work from life's prime need into life's prime want, I think is important, because then you could pursue technology for its own sake. You could pursue human activity for its own sake. You could pursue work for its own sake. Which, by the way, is what we're supposed to be doing in capitalism. Right? So that's bourgeois freedom right there.
That's the formal demand.
Right.
Like, you're supposed to find the thing, like I call productive activity that you actually affirm, that you want to get out of bed and repeat. I call that having a passion. We want work to be passion. And it's sold to us like, hey, in capitalism, you can pick what you do. But the point is, wage labor itself as a structure doesn't allow people to live. It doesn't make good on this.
Doesn't
People
make
do
good
not
on
get
it.
to
Doesn't
live
actually
lives of
support it.
passion here.
That's right. And I think that, again, the reason for that has to do with, does have to do with economics. It does have to do with value in the system. You know, so what you're talking about, so not C1 versus C2, but C prime. So not like C1M, C2, but like MCM prime, enhanced M. So you're talking about enhanced C. And to me, you know, there are different ways of thinking about enhanced C. If C is commodity, then you could be thinking about enhanced use value or enhanced exchange value. I mean, you may not like this move that I do, but I tend to do this. When people are thinking beyond capitalism, actually they're thinking capitalism. Meaning, aren't we already doing that? Right? Aren't we trying to repurpose, squeeze use value, and squeeze exchange value, right? Aren't we trying to have enhanced commodities? And, you know, that whenever we're thinking about the future, like what we want and the incentive structure, probably that's already emerging now within capital. And it's not about finding an alternative to it. Thinking about how to realize better what we're already doing. And at a political level, thinking about that in terms of, would the working class choose this? Or would this be chosen by the capitalists on a pure, like a narrow notion of economic efficiency, namely returns on capital? Right? In other words, who is in the position to be making the decisions? And how are those decisions actually motivated?
Yeah.
Right?
Who is in the position to make those decisions? Because again, like it seems to be the case that this perverse efficiency ultimately doesn't benefit any one person or even any one class. Like, because we can see how even at the top they're not really free, or they're not able to have their freedom.
Right.
Which is I know for me personally, which is why I do tend to want to characterize capital as the thing that is ultimately calling the shots.
Compulsive.
Yeah.
Right. There's a social compulsion to it. And again, what would it mean to extricate ourselves from the peculiar form of compulsion that the system is under? And that's an even stranger thing, which is to say that part of the need to maximize capital has to do with the fact that capital destroys itself. Right? So we need more capital to do things now than they needed in the past.
Can I hold on? I just want to quote you because I actually posted this on X earlier. You say capitalism is its own practical critique, reproducing itself by constantly overcoming itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
that's right.
So you know, part of I wonder if this new incentive structure, this new compulsion, could it come out of just the failure of the capitalist system itself, but things have to keep going. And so some sort of virtual compulsion would have to take hold for us to survive a collapse.
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, I think that capitalism is macro and micro. It's at both levels. So, this is something that I guess I get from Marx, from the Grundrisse, the Robinson Crusoe idea, which is that even if you're cast out, you reproduce it yourself, And so even if there was a massive collapse, depopulation, the people who would be left would still be doing capitalism, sadly,
But would the necessities, the unforeseen necessities of that new situation force the incentive structure to drastically recalibrate itself in some, I don't know.
Possibly. But again, I think that what we have now, how we think of efficiency, how we think of the utilization of labor, how we think about, also consumption, life. Like, so if we're talking about subsistence goods, talking about the production of subsistence, what do we even mean by subsistence? Like Marx talked about, the meaning of human requirements. It's in the 1844 manuscripts. What do we even mean by human requirements? And again, he says, well, of course, it's subject to qualitative change. Nonetheless, we have to take seriously the way it appears to us now. Right? So I think that the evil infinity that we're in, the bad infinity that we're in capitalism, is that capitalism keeps going by destroying itself, but we reconstitute it based on the bourgeois social relations of labor, meaning people have to survive by their labor. And we feel like, okay, if you want something from society, you have to contribute to it. Right? And so the system tears itself down and we reconstitute it through the bourgeois social relations. And we do it according to some rough sense of justice with regards to labor. I mean, I'm not sure what the incentive structure means. There's the personal incentive structure and there's the systemic incentive structure. Again, there's the micro and there's the macro. And they don't quite line up. They don't, in fact. So we try ideologically to say, there's like rational choice theory. There's like the neoliberal kind of ways of thinking about this that are clearly bizarre and not quite right, but they seem to hook up the micro and the macro in some way. But again, that seems to be over now, right? It seems like we're back to, the state has to make big decisions about $1 trillion, of investment, like it's not market driven at all, It seems like the state is back, just saying we're picking winners and losers. We are, I mean, they always were, but now they're just saying that's what, it's like Stephen Miller said something like, from time immemorial, it's been about power, and that's like the opposite of neoliberalism, which was like, oh, well, when anyone tries to do that, it backfires. And so you got to let the market go, and it's like that's over.
Is the have you seen the memes of the penguin from the Herzog film?
You mean with Trump in Greenland? Or no?
Yeah, but I'm not on Twitter, so I'm not up on all the memes, but I've seen the image and like the penguin, he's walking away and it's right. I guess it's like a rehash of the men going their own way movement or whatever.
Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah. Man.
Is there a virtue in walking away? Because like the guys who are doing the meme and they're it's reactionary, like they're like, oh yeah, fuck yeah, totally. It's all the woke liberals ruin the world, but I guess trying to take that idea seriously, would there be a virtue in turning your back and walking off into the mountains, even if you're going to die in isolation?
No. Humanity needs you. You know,
I knew you were
humanity
going to say
needs you.
that.
Did you? Okay,
Yeah.
good. No, I mean, look, I'm doing this out of a sense of duty. I am.
Yeah.
Meaning, I do feel like, okay, I know some things that humanity needs to have access to, you know? And I mean, I definitely have a fantasy of tending my own garden. You know, can I be relieved of this duty?
Mhm.
You know? But I also feel like, well, you know, no, not really. I got it. You know, I have a duty to myself in my personal life, but I have a duty to society. And, you know, again, you know, like I've gotten something out of the gnosis of Marxism or something, you know, like it's like that it seems to otherwise vanish, and maybe we can't afford to
Well,
let
I
it
think
vanish.
you embody in your own way a Promethean spirit,
Mhm.
where it's trying to give something. And I think this is because it's like, ladies and gentlemen, what you've all been waiting for.
Hmm.
I recently told Nance, I think that if we want to champion Prometheus, then the opposite of Prometheus is the Yellow King, which Nance, that's his term for Epstein.
Mm-hmm.
And Epstein might be an instance of what it looks like for somebody to truly walk away from humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And so that I just want to pivot into this, and this will be the last main topic we cover here. But we just both Nance and I, we've been thinking about the Epstein files and this whole situation a lot lately, and we were like, Chris, show up and give us some sanity to all,
Yeah.
all in this
Yeah,
insanity.
please assuage our minds, because it really is a madness. It
Nance,
really is a
Nance, set the
contagious
context.
madness.
First off, tell people about the piece you wrote, and then
Yeah.
set the
Yeah.
context, and then
Yeah.
So
Definitely.
there's a TV show called True Detective that I've never seen.
Oh no. Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. I saw the first maybe 2 seasons. I think definitely the first season.
Yeah, I've heard it over and over again. I've heard people saying how good it is, but I've never seen it. But I've heard people talking about how it's related to The King in Yellow. Robert Chambers. It's an old Lovecraftian American Gothic short fiction. And Mikey and I were talking about The King in Yellow and True Detective, and Epstein, and the kind of like the very compelling madness that sets in when you start to I don't the QAnon thing, and all the people who are just on the internet, conspiracy theories. It starts out with a genuine concern. Over time, it eats away at their soul. They become monstrous themselves. So all this, and yeah, I wrote a short piece about it. I guess as a way to cope with it's driving me fucking insane too. But the way I've been coping is by avoiding the social media content about it and really trying to understand, okay, so is Epstein, does he represent a shadowy cabal who's really in control and capitalism is just their screen, or is Epstein ideology? Like, is Epstein going to become this figure that's actually useful to generate race tension and stuff, and take our eye off of, like, capital still is the big bad guy in the room. I think we probably all think that. But it's fucking maddening.
It is. It's almost designed to be. I mean, you know, so when I read your piece, I read it twice. And the first
Thank
time
you.
I read it, it was, I think that I was sort of thrown a bit by like the you know, what you're talking about here, like the chthonic character.
Yeah.
You know, so in psychoanalytic terms, is it Eros or is it Thanatos? You know, like, what does Epstein represent? And if it's a weird, like, you know, someone like him would probably have to be like compulsively sexual, right? In which case, there's a kind of neurotic character to it. There is this kind of Thanatos, death drive dimension to it, right? And I mean, one of the ways that I've been driven crazy by the Epstein thing, but also not driven crazy by it, is that I don't relate to it. And one of the ways I don't relate to it is that I don't think that I've ever wanted to be Epstein.
Oof.
Right? And yet I think that the people who are really into condemning Epstein want to be him.
Mm.
I think that's the thing, that it's like that they're condemning him as like a forbidden desire that they don't allow themselves. And I feel like, well, you know, I'm not sure that I ever had that desire. And so therefore I don't feel the need to condemn it as much. You know, I just don't relate to it.
The lady doth protest.
You know, it is a little bit like that, yeah. Also, I've also thought of it, you know, like, I'm gay, right? So that's the other problem. Is that to me, it's like, you know, a heterosexual man who and his, you know, middle-aged heterosexual man and his middle-aged heterosexual male buddies who are into teenage girls. How more boring can you get than that? You know? Like, you know what I mean? Like, at least, like, I don't know, isn't Prince Andrew known for, like, pegging? I think that he's known for pegging. Have you heard about
That's
this?
news to me.
No. Oh, you don't know this? You gotta look it up. I think it's Prince Andrew, where Sarah Ferguson, you know, his wife, is like, I let him have his mistresses because I'm not interested in pegging him.
Did
Right?
you hear he got arrested today? Supposedly, I guess.
I know, for financial improprieties. So, you know, at least it's not for like, you know, sexual prudery or something, you know.
Don't you think this
But
has something to do with the arrest, though?
I mean, it does. It does. But I also think that, I guess, if it's insider trading, it's insider trading. Meaning, like, if this stuff is out there, then aren't they kind of obligated to, like, you know, punish him for giving some insider trading type information, you know? You know, that's like a clear violation, you know? So it's like a safe charge for them to bring against him.
Yep.
You know? And then they can sort of politely skirt the issue. Right? Now, like, the wilder fantasies about Epstein and his circles of people, I just think are, yeah, it is like QAnon. It is, right? And then I just feel like, okay, whatever might have actually happened, it is more an issue now of this fantasy of what happened on the part of people who are thinking about it, obsessing over it, or are raging about it.
So, unlike Nance, I've kind of gone down the X rabbit hole because I'm like, okay, let's see.
Yeah.
And obviously, wild speculations. Nothing is, for the most part, evidence based. Now, here's where now I'm doing this almost out of a kind of like a Baudrillardian experiment, because we can have our disagreements with Baudrillard on like specific, like theoretical points, but every normie I know will, if you talk to them about this kind of situation, they're tapped into some Baudrillardian truth, which is they'll go, look, I don't know what to believe. I don't know what on screens, what can be verified, what evidence is there, and what they're really doing is getting at this: how do we actually have a reliable reality principle that we can apply that works in all these situations with online electronic media? And I think that's where Baudrillard, like, that's his staying power. You know, if somebody's like, oh, there's no real, well, I can point to the book and say, this is a book, it's real. And he would go, that is not what the point is.
Right.
The point is, when you have this flood of electronic images dispersing this sprawl across all these screens,
Right.
how do we verify? How do we apply any sort of principles of evidence to say this is true, this is not. What you end up with is a whirlwind of this starts off having some being based in some evidence. Then you fill it in with conspiracy theories, some sort of dark fantasy, like you're talking about, is the libidinal driver of all this. And it all ends up in a kind of whirlwind of insanity that nothing is established, nothing is proven, nothing is verified, and yet it's just a cyber positive feedback loop of just intensity that goes nowhere and accomplishes nothing. And that's why Nance is warning, like, don't let Epstein be the Yellow King. Don't let this destroy your sanity.
Well, and I mean, having conversations with average everyday people, they'll say things like, "Oh, isn't it weird that most of these guys have Jewish names?" Wink, wink.
I'm
You know,
dealing
like
with this with people, some of the people I know. It's and
yeah, like
then they take that and then
it's taken our eyes off what's really happening and it's replacing it with
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, look, there are layers to it. So the less insane layer is the idea that it gives us a window into how the world works. And um, the elite networks, basically, in academia, in corporate America, in high finance, and also in, like, I guess, government, you know foreign policy circles, something, diplomacy, and then of course intelligence agencies, you know not so much organized crime. What's interesting is that, like, Panama Papers had this organized crime character to it, you know um so it's a very specific notion of who runs the world and how they run it that seems to be very much about this moment, how we conceive of power in this moment. And I mean, the anti-Semitism, I wouldn't say it's the driver of it, but it greases the wheels,
Mhm.
right? It facilitates it. And again, like Israel, Zionism, and just this imponderable thing for people of, like, why does the US support Israel so much? And it's like, it's pretty straightforward, it's like Israel, like, if you look at, like, relative economies of the Middle East, Israel is just disproportionately present in the global economy. And it has been, like, a kind of relatively stable state and reliable military force in a way that other countries have not in the region. And especially in more recent history, where you've had, like, the Arab Spring and civil wars, like Libya, Syria, there's been a lot going on. And I just feel like, it's not easy. It's not, I should say, it's not difficult to understand why Israel would be the country in the Middle East that the Europeans and the Americans and the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Taiwanese and the Chinese, we should be, honest about that too. Why is Israel the country that they deal with the most? It's not because Israel's manipulating them. It's because they're the most profitable trading partner and most reliable, business partner. So I don't know, but instead, it's got to be, oh, well, there's something untoward going on here. Rather than thinking like a volatile region of the world that has some importance, historically with oil, and then, who's your reliable client state in the area, especially after Iran was lost in the Islamic Revolution, right? Although it might be regained,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and you mentioned Cuba. Cuba's probably going to be reabsorbed. They're probably going to do something similar to what they did in Venezuela. You know, They're gonna do some kind of like decapitation of the regime, but basically keep it in place. They're gonna do something, and that's just happening, right? And I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's an unfortunate way that Epstein serves a purpose to symbolize things, to be this nexus in a way that, I feel like it wasn't that long ago that people were talking about the Davos conspiracy, they were using COVID to like control us and to like, force us into some like eco austerity kind of regime. And you're gonna own nothing but be happy. I watch Fox News, so I've been watching this evolve, right? So it seems like also the other part of it is that the two political parties in the United States, they've found it convenient to use Epstein against each other. So Trump used it against the Democrats when he was out of power, and now that he's in power, the Democrats are using it against him. So it's just, it serves. Like the Epstein story serves. Now, the more crazy part, so that's all the sober part, right? The crazy part is, why do we have to imagine this chthonic realm of capitalism? Why do we have to personalize it? Why does it have to be personally embodied by people? Well, I guess because we need to be able to tell a story. We need to have like villains. We need to have like characters. You wrote about this. We can't think about like the impersonal force of capital as like this evil that we're facing, because actually that's more terrifying. All right, that's far more terrifying than it is to think of the depravity, the unlimited depravity of human beings, because that's tame by comparison,
Well, right, and capital as this impersonal force. I mean, that's why if we do capital AI, I call it Robo Cthulhu, because Cthulhu is indifferent towards
Right.
us. I mean, we might
Right.
go mad if we encounter Cthulhu, but Cthulhu doesn't. He's not. But it's funny. The Yellow King in this mythos is actually Cthulhu's brother, but the Yellow King's evil, has ill intent, and that's where I feel like this ideology goes. So, okay, the anti-Semitism thing, Slavoj always pointed out with his theory of ideology, anti-Semitism's the go-to example, default. It's you scapegoat.
Default.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But there's a twist in this where capitalist ideology could say, no, see, this economic system isn't that bad. You have extreme pedo-cannibalistic perverts running things behind the scenes. If we could just get rid of them.
The illegitimate. Right.
And it's almost like Cthulhu going, I'm not that bad. It's the Yellow King. And like, and so that is this thing. I'm like, I'm afraid that the cabal will come to eclipse capital as what people are focusing on when it comes to taking on the system. And
right. So the Ro Khanna, the Epstein class, right? It makes it tractable politically, right? So I think it's the tail end of a reform impulse that's been frustrated in the post 2008 world. So I think that, for me, the millennial left, maybe they were delusional that they thought that they wanted socialism, whereas really what they wanted was progressive, reformed capitalism. And that's cool, right? Like, I don't really have a problem with that, actually. I just think that the political will for it has been lacking, and that's why we get Trump instead. We just get this guy who just, is just going to try things. Is just going to be like, well, have you tried this? Have you tried that? Rather than some kind of like masterminded, think tanked technocratic vision that will be implemented. It never works that way anyway, right? Like, not even the New Deal was really that. But it was a lot closer to that than what Trump is doing. And so I think that the frustration with that is, it seems like, oh, it's such a tangible possibility, like, why can't we have it? It must be because there are these evil people blocking it, but it's not even like that account is given either. It's just, oh, look at how depraved these people are. And maybe that's why they're not listening to our complaints and our demand for reform, because they're too busy, like, raping children. It's a weird displacement, isn't it? But I think that it's born of this protracted, it's like a 20-year thing now of like, system is fucked up, why aren't we fixing it? And maybe, so there's a kind of Gnostic aspect to it too. But I think that in the more sober realm, it's because the possibility of reform has seemed tantalizingly close. Like Bernie and now Mamdani, right? And so it seems like, oh, they're if we could just get rid of the bad people, actually the system could be reformed. And of course, the system can be reformed. It can. I just, my view, I have the long view. The long view is the system can be reformed, but ultimately the problem of capitalism will catch up with us again. Like, we'll defer it, but we'll only defer it. We won't, it's not like, I was just reading recently, it's crazy. When they set up the Fed, they were like, this will be the end of the business cycle. We won't have these boom bust cycles anymore. And in 20 years, they had the Great Depression. They had the Great Crash and Depression, right? And that there's actually a very reasonable argument to be made that the Fed, far from preventing it, made it worse. Right? And so, again, as a Marxist, I do have a version of unintended consequences, the right-wing idea of unintended consequences, which is that every solution to the problem of capitalism just sets up the next crisis of capitalism, sets up the next collapse, plants the seeds, right? And so, but again, we are living, I do think that things are politically contingent. I do think that politics matters. I do think that there's a lack of the ability to get it together politically. And that's why it's falling to like one guy who's just going to like force of will. You do whatever he can, and it probably won't really work. But it doesn't seem like there's an ability to cohere a reform agenda broader than that.
Okay, so
Right.
I want to. So, okay, this problem of evidence, right? So when I was going down this rabbit hole, I kept going, all right, people are reading these emails and then they
Right.
fill in the blank, right? So the Baudrillardian skepticism, if we push that to the limit, would be, should we even trust that these are real emails?
There's that problem. The basic problem is that they include everything submitted to the tip lines.
Yep.
Right? Like, so it's just any accusation that's been made, right? And so it's all just, because the FBI, I guess, collects everything.
Jay-Z, people are throwing Jay-Z under the bus now because he was named in an anonymous tip. And I want to go, it's not even an email like
Right.
correspondence with Epstein. Just
Right.
somebody called one of those hotlines and said Jay-Z did something to them, like at with Weinstein or something. And it's just like, that's not evidence. That's
Not
not
evidence.
no. Now,
Well, we're in Me Too land, believe all women. Meaning we should default to believing accusations.
so
because
anything on
will
any
make false
screen that
allegations.
accuses anybody of anything ought to be believed.
Well,
I don't mean you're
we are-
saying that, but like even
that's
them.
the idea.
But I don't I mean, even if you took the most Me Too of the most Me Too movement, like even this, they wouldn't they, at some point there has to be some third party social institution that looks through these types of
Adjudicates.
accusations and asks, okay, it's not true because you made an accusation. There has to be some sort of due process where evidence is provided. And look, so when I'm reading them, I'm like, okay, I try to be of different minds. Like, all right,
Mhm.
let's take these emails that I'm reading and say they are reliable, real emails. I will say this. There's some weird shit just in the actual emails where
Right.
there's stuff that makes me go, oh, they are eating people. Like, and that's just basic because they keep using this code word jerky. Oh, I'm gonna walk the jerky down to you, and oh, and then Epstein's mad because his personal chef, who literally owns a fucking restaurant called Cannibal, uh, I'm not bullshitting. This guy's been on like the Food Network. I watched the clip, and so he has this guy. He's his personal chef, and Epstein's like, all I do is eat jerky. I've got 2 pounds left in the freezer, but it's not enough. I need you to cook the jerky, and I'm not back to being on a normal diet yet. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but this is, and I'm like, he's not talking about snapping into a Slim Jim. Okay, so what the fuck is he talking about? And it's not just, there's the pizza code word, and then there's
Oh yeah,
there's
pizza
all
and grape soda.
grape soda and it's all this shit that's in there, and you're like, okay, adults don't talk like this, so they're hiding something, and that is just in the emails. That's not going through the conspiracy videos around it.
Right. Just there.
So there's that. But then I try to take a step back and go, can I rely on these emails being, I don't know. And this is where I feel the Baudrillardian perplexity, where it's like the reality principle is a principle of trust. Like, okay, if X, then Y. If you provide this evidence, then it's real, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just feel this void of epistemological criteria that can nail this shit down. And I see my coworkers, I see my friends living in this Baudrillardian vortex. And I don't know what the solution to this, but I feel like we need a return of the real in like the epistemological sense of how do we reclaim evidence-based argumentation.
Well, especially because we get fragmented snapshots of things. Like, because I'm thinking like the Gaza war or like the Maduro, kidnapping or arrest or whatever you want to call it, abduction, capture. What happened? Was he sold out by Delcy Rodriguez? Probably, but are we going to know that? No, because she doesn't have an interest in telling us that, and the government doesn't have an interest in telling us that, right? And so, there's like these state secrets basically that are there for very specific reasons. On the other hand, there's like forensic, like police work. And I feel like, the police investigate things to make cases in court. They don't investigate things to find out the truth. Right? Like, meaning they don't have the resources to find out the truth. They have resources to make cases, to find evidence that can be used in court for cases. And given that, right, like, are we dealing with epistemology at all? Right? Like, in other words, like, the government's not interested in knowledge. Right? What they consider to be
the case, right?
Right. And what they consider to be actionable data is very narrowly defined for specific purposes. Otherwise they're just like shit happens, like they're very aware of what they can and cannot do. They're aware of the limits of their own competence.
I mean, let me ask you this. Plato talked about philosopher kings. Do we need epistemology cops?
I mean, presumably, like, look, okay, so journalism, right? Journalism, like investigative journalism, right? Investigative journalism now is what, research on the internet? But what about the fact that you can't find shit on the internet? Like, I remember when you could find shit on the internet. Now you can't find anything, right? It's like crazy. And it's because there's too much information on the internet. Like, you used to be able to find it when there was less of it, and now everything has to be algorithmically mediated, and that's why you can't find anything.
Yeah, if you don't have the algo blessing, I mean.
Right. And then, of course, we know that people pay to have their results pop up higher on the search engine. But I also feel like just some things are just memory hold on the internet. They're just gone.
Mm.
Like I know that I found something on the internet 10 years ago and I can't find it now. I know I read something somewhere and I try to look for it now and it's just gone. And so journalism, investigative journalism, even investigative journalism is like motivated in specific ways. So it's like a commodity, first of all, but then there's like politics. We have conspiracy theories about things in the 60s and 70s, about JFK assassination, about Vietnam, about RFK assassination, MLK
The
assassination.
moon landing.
Yeah, the moon landing, Malcolm X assassination, Watergate, Nixon. Like, was he taken out by the deep state? Yeah, probably. Were Woodward and Bernstein on it? Were they being used by the deep state as journalists to enact an agenda, or were they like, just like interested, concerned citizens, telling truth to power, or were they just manipulated, right? And it's kind of like it's a mixture of things, isn't it? Right? And I so and I think that now things are even more murky or even more opaque. And part of it has to do with that we've even lost like whatever slim ethos there was to journalism, and it's rapidly disappeared in the last like 20 or 30 years. It's I think this came up with like Judith Miller and the Iraq invasion, right? Like it's like, are journalists just uh you know reporting press statements from the government, right? Are they just mouthpieces for policy? Right? And obviously, like, look, we've lived through like the Russia Gate, Russia conspiracy, Russia collusion hoax, and all this stuff. And so when Trump says Epstein is just a repeat of the Russia collusion hoax, I'm very sympathetic. Meaning they're like, oh, people used to say I was manipulated by Russia, now they're saying I'm being manipulated by Israel. And he's like, I'm not being manipulated by anybody. But maybe he is, because after all, we know that the Democrats, when they impeached him, they're like, he could be a Russian asset without realizing it, because like Putin's such a mastermind that he can use people without them even knowing that they're being used. And I'm sure there's some truth to that. But I just feel like it just so obviously, like on the surface, seems like people feel like the world is out of control. And therefore they have to feel like, well, somebody is in control. And so maybe, so they're frustrated with Trump, like I've been writing about this. Like, was Trump used by Netanyahu, or is he in conflict with Netanyahu?
Oh, and
like,
Nick Fuentes has, he's totally like going off about Trump and he's done with it and blah blah blah. So, I mean, some of Trump's core supporters are.
Or Mearsheimer is like, he's wholly owned by Adelson, and I'm just like, he's a billionaire president. He doesn't give a shit. He wants to go down in the history books. He's, he might be manipulated by people, but he's not owned by anybody. Like I do feel like if they had dirt on Trump, the ruling class is so hostile to him being president that if they had dirt on him, they would have used it. It's 10 years now. And so I feel like it's a funny mismatch between like, obviously, and that's what that's the thing. They won't ever be satisfied with the Epstein story until they find a video of Trump raping a child. And like, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Right? And so that means that it's just bottomless. Right? So it can never be, you can never, prove a negative. So it can never be disproven that actually Trump is being controlled by Israel via Epstein.
Okay, so the last question I have for you tonight is it's related. The other day I was seeing, I was watching this go down. Doug Lane was defending Chomsky, and of course catching a lot of
Flack.
shit, yeah, for doing this. And what do you think about this situation with Chomsky and Epstein, and should this affect how we view Chomsky as a thinker? Does it discredit him?
I
Where
was
you at
never a
with
fan
this?
of Chomsky to begin with. That's the
Okay.
problem, is that I was never a fan of Chomsky to begin with. I thought that he was an anti-Marxist bullshit artist, like, and I, I met him when I was in college, and I asked him a question, and he gave me a bullshit answer, you know, about Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin and Marxism, and and so I just feel like I was never impressed by Chomsky. And actually, I had a professor in college, Iqbal Ahmad, who Pakistani, Indian, and also knew a lot about the Middle East because he fought in Algeria in the FLN, and he knew a lot about Israel Palestine. And he told me when I was in college, he's like, "Yeah, the Palestinians are fucked. It's all over." And that was like 1990, 1991. So um, but he said, there's not really going to be a socialist revolution in America, Chris. And, the left in America, probably the best you can get is Chomsky. And I was like, Ekbal, don't condemn us like this. Like the best we can do is Chomsky, like then we're really fucked. you know? And so, okay, so that's my opinion of Chomsky. And I'm also sympathetic, that in the linguistics world, that they've done this debunking of Chomsky as a linguist, and they did this experiment, and they called the chimpanzee who they used to like debunk Chomsky, they called him Nim Chimpsky.
Oh no.
It's like great, but this is like a long time ago or whatever, right? And so I would always refer to Chomsky as Nim Chimpsky. Right?
Of course you
would. Right? So at the same time, it's not like I want to defend Chomsky, because I also want to say in academia, star faculty have to deal with funders. So Chomsky was a professor at MIT. And therefore, like Epstein was some kind of like funder, or he was schmoozing with the people who funded these things. And so one of the things that universities do is that they trot out their star faculty to meet the rich people. And I feel like Chomsky himself certainly knew what that was all about. Right? Like, in other words, he probably didn't have any illusions about that. And he made his compromises to, be an academic star in that world.
What the left right now, at least certain online left types, what they can't forgive him for is like, okay, so after Epstein was originally convicted, Chomsky was still emailing with them, giving them words of encouragement and all of that. And that's where they're like, nah, like we're not forgiving you for that. I mean, I understand the sentiment. I don't know what going off about it online does, I guess.
Well, it was part of the Me Too moment. And I think probably Chomsky, I guess what's been revealed is that Chomsky was a Me Too skeptic. And I think that that's what's unforgivable. And, like I'm a pre-canceled person. So, of course I'm a Me Too skeptic too, but nobody cares about me, right? But Chomsky, it's like, because Chomsky is like a sentimental leftist, he's a moralist, he's whatever. And so, whereas I'm just like, yeah, it's beyond good and evil, children, Marxism, yeah, it's not driven by morals, like, we're gonna make the revolution here. So, which doesn't mean that we have to engage in depravity, right? But it does mean that, like, yeah, you're not gonna this is not Gandhi. This is not a Gandhian proposition. But so I want to say that he's morally compromised, Chomsky, but in a very ordinary way. And not in an outrageous way. And I don't know what his thought process was. In other words, do you deal with someone who's been convicted that basically is still like greasing the wheels for funding for your institution and for your friends and colleagues. And, like, in other words, do you just take a kind of agnostic attitude of like, okay, he was convicted of this in court and, he took a plea deal and, like, I don't know what the thought process that was there with Chomsky. But so I think that the issue is like turning a blind eye, right? And that, again, it's part of the Me Too moment, which is, and it's the rape culture idea, that we live in a culture that doesn't condone rape, but it does tolerate it. It turns a blind eye to it, right? And so it's implicated in some way. And, I don't know how much that applies to Chomsky or not, and I don't know what the specific conditions for that were in that instance, meaning he was dealing with Epstein in a particular way, and so he might be very specifically motivated to turn a blind eye. Rather than like we're just thinking about it as like generally should people tolerate abusive people in their midst? That it's more specific than that, it seems. Like now, does that show us something about what's wrong with the world? It does. It does. There's no denying that. However, it's also limited in what it tells us about what's wrong with the world, and therefore what's wrong with people like Chomsky, who have to function in this world. And function in that specific world of academia with rich donors and those kinds of circles. I watched a Ezra Klein podcast this week with basically like a gossip columnist, and basically trying to get into the psychology of these circles of people, and how Epstein insinuated himself into people's lives and ingratiated himself with people and seemed to care about them and like conned them basically and manipulated them.
Like even in the Netflix documentary, he's paying for your sister wants to study art in Europe. Here, I'll make that happen for her. And
right, doing favors for people. And and I feel like, okay, so this is what ordinary people feel cut out from. They feel like they don't have people advocating for them like this. And so they resent that. They resent the way rich people seem to take care of each other. Do favors for each other. And it's also the case, it's a small world. Like when you get above a certain level, it's a very small world. Right? And so what we were talking about earlier about purging neoliberalism from the system. And because it's a small world, it was easy for Epstein to establish a lot of connections with people, and an easy way of like lopping off a layer of people who are inculpated in the neoliberalism is to just, everyone who turned a blind eye to Epstein, just purge all those people, purge all the political people, all the corporate people, all the cultural people, and it might work out like that. I don't know. Without it having to be like a lot of evidence. In other words, it doesn't take much to show that people the blind eye.
Yeah.
And that might be considered bad enough. And it doesn't even have to be like cannibalism or like, it doesn't have to be all that. It could just be like the prostitution of underage girls. But that's enough, like to turn a blind eye to that, which they basically, the media just says raping children. What that means is an underage prostitute equals raping children. And I don't like that. I don't like that extreme demagogy. I don't. Like, I think there are children who are raped. Like, there is actual sexual slavery in the world. Like, that exists. And so it doesn't seem like that's what that was with Epstein. But maybe it was.
I think some of that was going on.
Possibly, but I just know that like in the third world, in the United States, like in Chicago right now as we speak, there's a child tied to a bed being raped to death. And that's You know, like that's like millions of people around the world. And so I think Epstein's like a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
Next to that, you know? And so again, that's more like, that's the more uncomfortable reality of like, like immigrant communities, the working class, it's like, ugh, like prostitution like that, you know? And, so obviously it's easier to talk about the rich people who in a sense like have no excuse, right? Or something.
But ideologically, I would
Yeah.
just bring it back to where the problem, the way this can be used is look at what these poor people have gone through. What are you complaining about when you have a job and you have a paycheck and you like, it's a way of saying the system's not that bad. And so that's what that's where I get worried about how this could be weaponized against us. I think we've
That's
talked
true
for
too.
I think maybe we should wrap it up. We've talked your ear off.
Yep.
And,
Cool.
Nance, you have any closing thoughts here?
Epstein as ideology. I also would like to have a future conversation about aliens as ideology, because that's another one of my.
You hear Obama
Like-
just said
Yeah.
aliens are real.
Yeah. But no, I think it's important to I don't know, to point out how is this ideology? Like, yes, this is a bad thing, and we can moralize about it, and we can be horrified about it, and we can even let it drive us mad, which people do. But I think the way to avoid the madness is to say see how this is ideological, and see how this is kind of taking your eyes off these other things that maybe things you could do or where you could be effective locally, politically, things like that. So I do think it's important. While I've also been telling everyone, just ignore the Epstein shit.
It's a weird sense of justice though, isn't it? Like Larry Summers, I guess, has withdrawn from public life.
Yeah.
And right. And I'm just like, okay, so he's like some like villain of neoliberalism. He's like a neoliberal economist who therefore is, implicated in the problems of neoliberalism. And so, I just think, again, obviously it's not going to accomplish anything to purge neoliberalism from the system. It's not, like you get rid of everybody over 50, except for the few saints, the few people leading the charge, like Ro Khanna or whatever, right? And Bernie or whatever. But that's not going to solve the problem. Everybody knows that's not going to solve the problem. But will it give people a sense of justice? Will it? I mean, maybe it will. I don't know.
And then what?
And then what? Right?
What is justice? What is the sense of justice?
Is it for the victims? Closure for the victims? Like I can understand that to a certain extent. But then we have this again vicarious sense of justice. So like people feel like there should be justice for the victims. What does that amount to? And what's our investment in it as the general public? Right. So I guess I'm focused on it at a political level, and I'm a little neutral on that, meaning I'm just like, all right, go to town, like get rid of everybody associated with Epstein, purge them from public life, punish them, send them all to jail, fine, right? Like some kind of weird reset of the political order that way, I guess. I don't know. It doesn't seem like it's even going to accomplish that much, but let's say it could accomplish that much. Then it's like, I don't have an objection to that. I also don't feel particularly like excited about it, and I certainly don't think that we can build on that. Right? I mean, it seems like it's about the Republicans, Trump, whatever, but also it's about like the Democrats, like the bad Democrats who are in the way of the progressive Democrats. It seems like that's what it's about, and I kind of feel like there was a moment where it seemed like Hillary and Bill were going to testify in Congress, right, and whatnot, and I guess they did some like behind closed doors testimony or something's going on, right? And I feel like, okay, so maybe the millennials want to like have Bill and Hillary be sacrificial victims, satisfy their desire for justice, I guess.
Bloodlust.
And yeah, something. And I kind of feel like, I can pretty much authentically say I've always hated the Clintons. But there is part of me that's like, I still don't want to, like, I'm not satisfied by scapegoats. I'm just not. I'm not. I don't know.
Well,
I don't get that kind of satisfaction. Or let's put it this way. I would get as much satisfaction out of Trump putting Bill and Hillary in jail as I would Ro Khanna putting them in jail.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe more so because I kind of feel like Trump and Hillary deserve each other,
Yeah, a little bit more probably.
Don't you think they kind of deserve each other, And so
can they
like
both send each other to jail?
I guess so, right? But so the whole Russia collusion hoax and Hillary and all that stuff, like I was just like, yeah, it would be turnabout is fair play or something. But now we're in a different realm. I feel like the Epstein story is in a different realm. It's taking it to a different place. So I feel like my perverse pleasure in this kind of stuff, in the inter-elite war, is spent. And I definitely, I can't get on board with the Puritanism of the new progressives. Not like the same way, as opposed to like who's the worst like indulger / abuser of women, Bill Clinton or Donald Trump? And we're gonna have this sexless scold Hillary adjudicating it. That she can't punish her husbands. She's gonna punish Trump instead. Like that's a story that makes sense to me. The Epstein story doesn't quite make sense. I don't know.
Well, on that note, Chris, this has been great. Thank you so much. And everybody here, check out Chris's work. I think it goes like this.
That way, yeah.
He's up.
Yep.
And
excellent.
Again, he is teaching this whole year at Philosophy Portal, so you can head on over there and check that out. And this has been great. We have been in the Cutrone zone, and thank you for the perspective. I feel a little bit more sane at the end of this, so thank you for that.
Excellent. Good.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys.
Later.
Thanks, Chris.
It's basically people who are over 50. Like nobody really under 50 is implicated in Epstein.
So is everybody over 50 in the Epstein files?
Pretty much, I think so.